A city of tens of thousands was erased, not by war, not by raiders, not by the slow decay that claims most things in the open desert, by a decision, and the person who made that decision wrote a date on a chalkboard, then wiped it clean before his daughter could finish reading it. Welcome to this calm journey through forgotten facts about the new California Republic. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And if these quiet explorations are something you enjoy, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. What remains here today is a circle pressed into the earth south of Los Angeles, a wide flat depression ringed by broken concrete and rebar jutting upward like the bones of something buried too shallow. Irradiated dust drifts across the open ground without settling. Nothing takes root at the center. This hollow is too perfectly round, too clean at its edges, to have resulted from ordinary collapse. That precision is what makes it difficult to stand beside, without thinking about who authorized it and why, and whether that person ever believed they would need to answer for it. There is no marker here, no name cut into stone, no indication of what this ground once held, just the shaped earth and the silence that followed. In the first season of the Fallout television series, this location is revealed as the former capital of the new California Republic, a governed city that once held tens of thousands of inhabitants behind proper walls, with functional halls, schools, civil guards, and the kind of infrastructure that requires generations to construct. The series handles this reveal carefully. For much of the opening episode, the depression in the ground is presented as ancient damage, one more scar attributed to the Great War of 2077, old enough to carry no names and no faces. Only later does the truth arrive with its full weight. This destruction happened around 2277, within living memory, through a targeted nuclear event. The capital did not fall with the old world. It was brought down deliberately, through a plan running long before most of its citizens understood they were living inside one. A specific date was written on a chalkboard inside Vault 33, a sealed installation in California built to outlast the collapse of everything above it. The Vault's overseer, a man named Hank McLean, erased that date before his daughter Lucy could read the full notation. The act took seconds. What it protected had been constructed over many long stretches of careful planning. What it concealed changed the meaning of everything built above ground in the period between. Pale morning light spreads across this depression without warmth, touching ash and fractured stone in equal measure. That erasure points directly to what Hank McLean was concealing. He held no ordinary administrative role. His documented presence in the capital before its destruction, combined with his apparent foreknowledge of what followed, suggests a deliberate arrangement between Vault-Tec and the individuals placed in positions of authority across the closed shelter network. The NCR was not broken by Caesar's Legion, dismantled by the Brotherhood of Steel, or worn down by any external force that announced its intentions openly. The evidence assembled across the television series points instead toward a corporate act, a decision reached before the bombs fell in a conference room, by executives already mapping which post-war governments would be permitted to exist and which would not. Vault-Tec constructed more than shelters. Recovered terminal notations from multiple sites suggest this organization was engineering the long-term conditions of post-war civilization, including the removal of any elected body strong enough to challenge its own successor plans. By that accounting, the new California Republic was never intended to outlast its usefulness to someone else's longer design. It was meant to rise far enough to appear legitimate, and then be removed before it could become permanent. Whether those executives ever considered what they were building toward, or simply followed the plans placed in front of them, is a question this hollow cannot answer. The ash preserves no such reasoning. It preserves only the result. Inside the rubble of the former capital, one section of collapsed outer wall still holds traces of a large painted image. The mural depicts a two-headed bear rendered in the bold, flat visual language of mid-century American promotional art. Deep navy, faded gold. The kind of palette applied to posters designed to inspire confidence in something larger than any single person. This image was part of a small historical installation, built to document the early period of the Republic's existence. The visual approach carried specific intent. This government had always been designed to feel like a reconstruction of pre-war American identity, not only in governance, but in the stories it chose to circulate about its own origins. The same mythology that once dressed a country in eagles and optimistic language was borrowed, adapted only slightly, and applied to a banner bearing a creature that had already outlasted extinction once before. Borrowing that imagery was deliberate. The nation was telling its citizens it belonged to a tradition of endurance, stretching back centuries before the bombs fell. That kind of borrowed history is easier to believe when the alternative is no history at all. Grit moves across the open ground in thin drifts, carried by wind too low to register as sound. That creature was chosen with care. The two-headed bear was formally adopted as the national symbol during the presidency of Tandi, daughter of Aradesh, one of the initial founders of the enclosed settlement that preceded the capital. California grizzlies were among the early large animals documented returning to irradiated terrain after the bombs fell. They moved through conditions that destroyed smaller species and pressed forward without visible hesitation. To the early inhabitants of the founding community, the grizzly represented something necessary. That endurance was observable, that the damaged land could be reclaimed, that a creature built for difficult terrain had already demonstrated survival was more than an aspiration. The banner carried that meaning, without explaining it openly. Most of those who lived under it had no particular knowledge of the reasoning behind the image. They saw it and understood what they were meant to feel, which is precisely how durable symbols are designed to function. Tandy herself remains among the most carefully documented figures in intact written history. She first appears in early town records as a teenager inside the walled enclosure, before any formal legislature had been established. Many decades of remaining documents later, she occupied the position of president, a post she held for more than 50 continuous terms through repeated democratic selection. No other individual in the wasteland's known political history maintained that level of sustained popular trust across such a span of time. Her administration expanded the territory steadily, maintained functional oversight across absorbed regions, and consistently favored negotiation over force when either path remained available. She does not appear in remaining written accounts as a figure defined by dramatic turning points or celebrated crises. What those accounts preserve is someone who worked without interruption, was trusted without qualification, and continued to be chosen simply because those around her found no reason to stop. That kind of continuity is rarely dramatic. It is almost always more durable than drama. Nations tend to remember their moments of crisis and forget the long, steady work that made those moments survivable. Tandy was the steady work. She was the administrative continuity that allowed a collection of farming settlements to gradually become something with borders, laws, and the weight of institutional memory. Without that span of steady governance, the Republic might have remained what it started as: a walled town above a locked door, significant only to the inhabitants inside it. Within this hollow, absence carries its own texture. It is not emptiness. It is the particular weight of a place that once held something significant and no longer does. Between those initial years and the long presidency that followed, the NCR expanded at a pace that intact written documents struggle to account for completely. That early enclosed town was modest, its boundary marked by a stone perimeter, its inhabitants numbering fewer than 200. Water came from a single well fed by an underground source, and continuity of that supply could not be assumed from one dry season to the next. 80 stretches of time forward in the preserved record, that enclosure had transformed into a governing capital with a functioning legislature, an armed force divided into multiple branches, a caravan network extending across hundreds of miles, and a legal code covering absorbed territories. The transformation was genuine. Whether the pace reflected in the nation's stored written material represents the slow, painful accumulation of that progress accurately, or whether later writers compressed decades of setback and partial recovery into a cleaner narrative, is something this ash cannot resolve. What the ash does hold, in the form of recovered terminal passages from partially intact structures near the edge of this site, are the legislative paperwork of the NCR's final operating period. Among those stored records, one subject appears across multiple separate written accounts: the extended congressional debate over the Mojave Annexation Bill, the formal legislation that would authorize armed presence in Nevada. Those passages confirm the bill remained under revision and deferral long after NCR soldiers had already been stationed in the region for a considerable stretch of time. The authorization came after the deployment. In the margin notations of several congressional passages, no formal objection to this sequence appears. The constitutional problem was acknowledged in passing and set aside. An elected body was conducting a territorial expansion it had not yet voted to approve, and the clerks assigned to document those sessions wrote everything down faithfully and placed it in the correct folders. The folders remained. The structure that held them did not. What those sessions built, across all their deferred votes and filed objections and margin notations, was the legal architecture of an expansion that would eventually stretch from California to the Colorado River. It was imperfect. It moved faster than its authorization could follow, but it moved. And for a long stretch of time, that movement felt like progress to the citizens living inside it. Broken concrete catches the late light at the western edge of this circle, holding the color for a moment before shadow claims it. What stood here was brought down not by its own weakness. This capital did not fall because the principle behind it was flawed, or because those who constructed it lacked the capacity to defend what they had built. It fell because a more patient force had been working against it in advance. Before the initial wall was raised, before the first election was held, before the banner bearing the two-headed bear was sewn together. That is a specific kind of ending, not defeat but deliberate removal, carried out by those who understood that the most effective way to end something is to begin that process before the thing being ended knows it has started. This circle of ash is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of how a nation gets removed when someone decides, far enough in advance, that it must not be allowed to continue. The road from this hollow moves northwest through dry California hills toward older ground. Somewhere beneath those ridgelines, sealed under decades of undisturbed earth and poured concrete, sits the underground structure that produced the Republic's founding generation. Not a place of ceremony or triumph, but a door that was abandoned, and the long walk that began the moment a group of people stopped waiting for someone to open it from the other side. The hatch is still there, half buried in dry scrub, cracked along one seam. The number 15 stamped into the concrete over the frame in lettering worn, almost flat by decades of wind and sun. The locking mechanism has not turned in a long time. What rests beneath this patch of California interior has been undisturbed longer than most of the constructions visible from where that concrete frame breaks the surface. From this unremarkable stretch of earth, surrounded by low hills and grass that turns brown before summer ends, a nation grew. Not from a chamber of government, not from a written charter, read aloud to a gathered crowd, from a group of people who walked away from a door very much like this one, and had nowhere particular to go, and chose, in the absence of any guidance, to build something anyway. That decision was not obvious. Nothing about the circumstances of those first days above the surface would have made it feel like the most natural path. The alternative choices were visible, within walking distance, made by others who had shared the same closed space and the same departure. Some of those alternatives lasted longer than expected. One lasted long enough to become a nation. The others became its shadow. That choice was not random. It was the product of a design that Vault-Tec had embedded in the layout below. A design built around the assumption that the choice would not be made. This installation was engineered to fail as a community. Those placed inside were drawn from groups with deeply incompatible backgrounds, different customs, different languages, different beliefs about authority and ownership and obligation. The hypothesis written into the intake records was direct. Overcrowding combined with cultural friction would produce conflict. The conflict would produce data. Whether any resident survived the process was a secondary matter. The study ran as designed. Social cohesion inside the sealed levels collapsed. When those inside finally departed, they divided into 4 distinct raider organizations: the Kuns, the Vipers, the Jackals, and the Regulators. 4 groups, 4 different answers to the question of what groups do when the framework around them gives way. 3 of those answers involved organized violence as a primary strategy. 1 did not. The group that refused to become raiders walked north and built a farming settlement over an underground water source. That community eventually became the largest governed city on the West Coast. The new California Republic was born, in other words, from the fraction of a failed program that produced an unexpected outcome. A result Vault-Tec's planners had not anticipated and apparently never recorded. There is no evidence in any recovered intake material that the designers of this experiment considered what would happen if their subjects chose cooperation rather than conflict. The hypothesis was built entirely around failure. When a small number of people confounded it, the program's architecture had nothing to say about them. They simply became an unclassified result, the data point that did not fit, walking north in the California dust. The wind moves across the scrub at surface level, carrying the smell of dry soil and nothing else. Of the 4 groups that emerged from this location, only 1 survived intact long enough to appear in later historical accounts by name. That organization, named through a combination of cultural references within the initial membership, became the most extensively recorded raider group in the Western Wasteland. They moved across California and Nevada for generations, maintaining a loose arrangement that absorbed new members while preserving the group's core identity and methods. By the time conditions in the Mojave were recorded in detail, the Khans had been reorganized as the Great Khans and were operating out of Red Rock Canyon, reduced in number but still traceable as a continuous body stretching back to the same concrete door described above. The NCR and the Great Khans shared a founding moment, the same expulsion, the same first hours above the open land, without shelter or certainty, the same complete absence of any support from the institution that had put them there. One group built courts and laws and a flag. The other built a reputation that outlasted the conditions that produced it. The difference between the two was a single decision, made by exhausted individuals standing in the same empty landscape, with no particular reason to choose one direction over another. Neither group ever formally acknowledged what they had in common. In post-war territory, this is perhaps expected. The distance between those outcomes was too wide, and the intervening centuries too long, for either side to look back clearly at the same starting point. But the connection is preserved in the physical record of this location, in the number stamped above a concrete frame that both groups passed through on the same day, in opposite directions that proved to be permanent. Inside the sealed lower levels, directly beneath this soil, the intake processing area still holds terminal equipment that logged the first days of the program. The great cans came close to complete destruction on 2 recorded occasions, both directly involving the governing body that shared their point of origin. The more thoroughly preserved event took place at Bitter Springs, a canyon location used by Khan families, including those with no combatant role. A unit of NCR troopers initiated an assault during an operation intended to disrupt active raider activity in the area. The enlisted personnel involved misidentified the canyon inhabitants as legitimate targets. The attack continued after the misidentification became apparent. Non-combatants were killed alongside fighters. The event is preserved in the Mojave's available material through a combination of trooper accounts, a single terminal entry filed at Camp Golf, and the physical evidence of the canyon floor. Burial sites placed without markers, arranged in the pattern of interments, conducted under time pressure rather than with intention. No formal statement was ever issued under a title describing the nature of what had occurred. The ground preserved a record that the official written record chose not to create. In the wasteland, this is not unusual. What the landscape holds is often more precise than what the institutions that chose to file. Dust has settled into the grooves of the concrete frame, filling each indentation with pale grey powder. What the institutional paperwork does contain, or rather what it conspicuously does not contain, points toward a process that was initiated and then quietly abandoned. Early internal planning files indicate that a formal court-martial proceeding was being prepared against the officer who authorized the Bitter Springs assault. The charges were drafted. The procedural framework was outlined. Then the process stopped, without explanation, without conclusion, and without any notation formally recording the decision to stop it. In the dialogue of troopers stationed near Bitter Springs in the aftermath, a specific phrase survives that has no corresponding resolution anywhere in the available record. References to an ongoing review, described in the present tense, attached to neither a timeline nor an outcome. That phrasing functioned as a holding position, language that acknowledged something had happened, while ensuring that acknowledgement required no action. The review was never completed. The charges were never filed. The Republic demonstrated, in this instance, a capacity shared by most large institutions, the capacity to record its own failures with considerable precision, while maintaining an equally consistent inability to do anything with those records once created. Above the sealed lower levels, sitting over the intake chambers and dormitory blocks that held the original program participants, a different kind of encampment had been assembled. The Squat, a shanty town that had spread around and over the vault entrance, was occupied by those with no connection to the installation's original inhabitants. They had settled on available terrain, building with salvaged materials, and developed a community arrangement based on proximity and mutual necessity, rather than any deliberate plan. When the nation's territorial expansion reached this region, the Squat became an example of the absorption approach. The NCR had refined over decades of westward growth. Aid arrived first. Food, basic medicine, construction materials, delivered without explicit conditions attached, on a schedule that created dependency before any formal relationship was established. The representatives who accompanied the aid shipments were careful in their language. They spoke of partnership and mutual benefit, and the advantages of formal alignment. The political pressure that followed the aid was not sudden or aggressive. It was patient, which made it more effective than force would have been. Annexation arrived as the natural conclusion of a relationship that had been established in stages, each stage appearing reasonable on its own, the cumulative weight of them only becoming visible once the process was complete. The Squat did not fall, it was absorbed. There is a meaningful difference between the two. and the nation had long since learned to apply it. The scrub grass bends in unison when the wind shifts, then straightens again when the gust passes. The economy supporting this expansion operated, in the period described in Fallout 2, on the same bottle caps used by every trader and independent settlement across the wider region. An exchange medium improvised from the durable remnants of pre-war consumer packaging, given value by common agreement rather than institutional backing. The Republic had a functioning legislature, an annexed territory network, a standing armed force, and a monetary form indistinguishable from informal barter currency. The inconsistency was eventually addressed when the nation transitioned to printed paper notes, denominated NCR dollars, issued by a central authority, theoretically backed by the government's institutional stability and continued expansion. The transition introduced a different set of problems. The printed tender lost value faster than it circulated. Merchants operating in territories, the NCR was attempting to annex accepted the bills at rates that reflected actual purchasing power rather than printed denomination, a discount that grew as the government's military expenditures in Nevada outpaced its capacity to back the notes with tangible resources. The bills kept printing. The gap between face value and functional value kept widening. The pattern from the same UNSI sequence observed in every historical case of a government expanding faster than its financial architecture can accommodate. That institution's monetary collapse was not unique. It was simply more thoroughly recorded than most. Somewhere beneath this location, in a chamber that has not seen new light in a considerable span of time, a terminal screen may still be displaying the last entry it was left showing. The troopers who carried those depreciated notes into Nevada listened to a broadcast that transmitted no voice, employed no announcer, and offered no interpretation of what it was sending. NCR radio played a continuous sequence of pre-war country and folk recordings, music chosen because it carried the acoustic texture of American frontier optimism that the nation's identity had been constructed to invoke. That same sonic quality had accompanied government messaging in the Depression era, pairing songs about endurance and open land with appeals for collective effort and institutional trust. On NCR radio, the recordings transmitted without context into whatever range the signal could reach. Outposts, camps, forward positions where resupply had not arrived in weeks. No commentary, no acknowledgement of conditions at forward positions, no voice confirming that the signal was intentional and that someone on the other end was aware of what the listening posts were experiencing. A government speaking to its enlisted personnel exclusively through the medium of songs about hardship and distance, with nothing added, nothing withdrawn. The transmission continuing whether anyone was alive to receive it or not. What that signal could not transmit was the intellectual basis embedded in this vault's original design. The overcrowding study that Vault-Tec conducted in this location was not an original conception. It drew from research carried out in the 1960s by a scientist named John B. Calhoun, who constructed enclosed environments for mouse populations, and then recorded what happened as density exceeded the available space. The results were consistent across multiple trials. Normal social behavior persisted until the population reached a critical threshold, beyond which it developed what the researcher classified as pathological responses: aggression, withdrawal, reproductive failure, eventual collapse, even in the presence of adequate food and water. His findings were distributed widely among Cold War policy institutions, including the research organizations that shaped Vault-Tec's operational design philosophy. The connection between Calhoun's work and the parameters of this installation is not made visible in any surface-level material. Calhoun himself never described his research as applicable to human policy design, at least not in his published work. His findings were adopted by the institutions that read them not because he offered them as tools, but because the think tank culture of the Cold War era was organized around the conversion of any research with predictive value into a planning instrument. Vault-Tec was the inheritor of that culture. The study was designed to replicate his results in a human population under controlled conditions. In most respects, as the subsequent history of those who emerged from this door demonstrates, it did. The entry point does not open from outside anymore. Whatever the lower levels still hold, they hold without interruption. This vault offered its inhabitants constructed environment designed to break communal bonds, a door that eventually opened, and nothing further. No recovery package, no GEC. The Garden of Eden creation kit, a terraforming device provided to selected installations to enable post-collapse settlement. No functional water equipment beyond what was already failing at the point of departure. No external support of any kind. Those who walked out and chose not to become raiders constructed something from that absence that lasted 2 centuries and extended across half a continent. Those who made other choices also lasted, in their own ways, by their own methods. All of them came from the same sealed space. None of them were given anything to mark the occasion. The trade roads that run west from this location were already worn into the earth, before the Republic had a name for itself. The people who carved those paths through the California interior were not building a nation. They were looking for food, for water, for anything that could be exchanged for the things they lacked. The nation came later, assembled gradually from the accumulation of those individual movements, each one too small to notice, and together large enough to become the largest governing body the post-war West would ever see. The roads did not know what they were building. Neither did the people who first walked them. They moved toward the coast, toward the city that had organized commerce along every major route before any government arrived to take credit for the organization. That city kept the NCR's caravans moving and its early economy breathing according to its own logic, long before the nation grew large enough to make demands of it. That is the direction this road takes next. The dried riverbed cutting through the center of the hub holds no water now, and it held very little even when trade here was at its peak. What moved through it instead was commerce, the organized flow of goods, currency, and information along routes that spread outward from this delta in every direction, linking distant settlements that had no other reason to deal with one another. This city did not require a governing body to operate. It required roads, and it had built those roads long before any flag appeared above its market stalls. The hub predates the new California Republic by several decades, when the founding settlement to the north was still a small walled enclosure, drawing from a single underground well. This city was already functioning as the primary economic engine of post-war California, a place where caravan companies had established reliable routes, set competitive prices, resolved disputes through negotiation rather than force, and accumulated the kind of institutional knowledge that formal governments spend generations trying to develop. 3 organizations drove most of this activity. The Fargo traders ran long-distance freight across the most hazardous stretches of open terrain between communities. The water merchants controlled distribution of purified water across a region where clean liquid functioned as an absolute currency, more reliable than any manufactured exchange medium. The Crimson Caravans, smaller in those years, focused on standard goods and built a reputation on consistency rather than volume. When the NCR absorbed this city through the same gradual process, it applied to every community it incorporated. It did not construct a new logistical network from nothing. It inherited a functioning one. Trade routes became national supply lines. Trading companies became state contractors. The existing commercial infrastructure became the circulatory system of territorial growth, moving materials and currency to every incorporated region between the California coast and the Nevada border. What appeared to be national economic reach was, in practical terms, this city's reach operating under a different name. Dry air drifts through the open market stalls, carrying fine dust that has settled into the gaps between old paving stones. The trajectory of one of those companies across the following decades reveals how absorption worked in practice. In Fallout 1, the Crimson Caravans occupy a single building in the trading district. A mid-sized operation with a modest staff, competitive but unremarkable, one of several organizations moving through the same crowded market. By the time the Mojave's conditions are documented in detail in Fallout New Vegas, that same organization has become something fundamentally different. A near monopoly holding exclusive government contracts, maintaining a dedicated compound inside the walls of Camp McCarran, and staffed by a representative who discusses the deliberate undercutting of surviving competitors with the calm of someone whose position no longer requires discretion. The gap between these two versions of the same company spans the period of NCR territorial expansion. How a modest trading outfit became the preferred logistics contractor of the state. What arrangements were made? What smaller operations were displaced? What connections between the company's leadership and the government's administrative class produced this outcome is not preserved in any terminal entry or spoken line across either title. The result is simply present, visible in the distance between what the organization was and what it became. The process, in this case as in many others, did not distribute its advantages equally among those who had operated here before. The smaller trading outfits that had shared the market with the Crimson Caravans in the years before NCR expansion disappeared from the record gradually, not through any documented closure or formal displacement, but through the kind of quiet exit that happens when one organization holds the contracts and the others do not. Their absence is visible in the gap between the market district of Fallout 1, crowded with competing operations, and the consolidated landscape that the later period presents. The market did not empty, it consolidated, and consolidation, in the context of national absorption, tends to favor those who were positioned to receive the first contracts. Inside the old counting houses, ledger shelves that once recorded every transaction now hold only settled dust and silence. Those who operated here before absorption left their own accounts. Merchant terminal entries embedded in the buildings along the riverbed contain price lists that become meaningful when read against the surrounding economic circumstances. During drought periods, which this city's geography made recurring rather than occasional, the water merchant supplied markups to purified water reaching 400% above standard cost. The entries recording these figures used the neutral language of supply and demand. Scarcity had increased, availability had not. The price reflected the mathematical relationship between the two. When that governing body later imposed regulated pricing on water distribution, several personal journals, preserved in Fallout 2 terminal records, described the intervention in terms that would not appear in any official filing. One entry uses a specific phrase, the death of honest trade. The writer did not mean dishonest pricing had finally been corrected. They meant that the freedom to set prices without external constraint, the condition they had always understood as the foundation of commerce, had been taken away. From one angle, regulated pricing protected communities that could not absorb 400% markups during a dry season. From another angle, it was the precise moment this city stopped being a merchant hub and became an administered district. The resource that made access to clean supply so consequential was not the liquid itself, but what proximity to it revealed about the land beneath. This territorial push across California and into Nevada did not trace population density. It traced aquifer lines, the underground sources that determined which communities could sustain themselves through dry seasons. without depending on outside aid. The founding settlement had persisted through its earliest years because its well drew from an aquifer that Vault 15's geological survey records had mapped long before the inhabitants above ever knew that data existed. That survey material was recovered when this government took formal control of the territories surrounding the vault. The administrative logic that followed was consistent. Communities positioned over reliable underground sources were prioritized for incorporation because they represented durable, long-term investments. Larger settlements with uncertain access to clean supply were addressed later, once external infrastructure could reach them. What appeared to be growth driven by territorial ambition was, in its underlying logic, driven by the search for supply security. This trading city was valuable to the NCR not only for its established roots, but because it sat at the meeting point of several historically reliable underground sources in the California interior. Commerce was the stated reason for absorption. Reliable access was the permanent one. Pale afternoon, light crosses the market floor in long stripes, touching each cracked stone briefly before moving on. The shift from locally administered law to nationally administered law occurred between the events of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. Without being captured in any narrative, either title presents directly. In Fallout 1, this city maintains its own internal order through two independent groups: the Blades, who operated in the outer districts, and the Regulators, who handled enforcement within the central market area. Both maintained their own leadership, their own codes of conduct, and their own working relationships with the trading companies that effectively funded their operations. In Fallout 2, neither group appears. Republic Rangers have taken their positions. No quest describes the transition. No dialogue exchange references it. No terminal record explains it. The groups simply are not there, replaced by personnel in NCR insignia carrying Republic-issued equipment. The absence of any explanatory account was later recognized as a significant gap. The political transformation of a city that had administered itself for decades through independent organizations deserved its own written history. That history was never produced. What survives is the state before and the state after, separated by 80 years of unrecorded change. The Blades and the Regulators had not been perfect institutions. The accounts preserved from Fallout 1 describe them as occasionally corrupt, often underfunded, and prone to selective enforcement that favored those who paid for protection over those who needed it. But they were local. Their leadership lived in the same streets they policed. Their failures were visible to the people who experienced them. NCR Rangers operated under a chain of command extending back to a capital hundreds of miles away. A chain that made accountability slower, that filtered complaints through layers of bureaucracy before any response reached the field. The replacement was not simply a change of personnel. It was a change in the relationship between those who enforced the rules and those who lived under them. The personnel who replaced those independent organizations developed, over time, into something the city's original law enforcers had never resembled. NCR Rangers, as documented in Fallout New Vegas, are described across multiple sources as the nation's long-range specialist corps. Scouts trained for desert operations at extended distances from supply lines, drawing on tactical manuals salvaged from National Park Service archives and frontier enforcement records recovered during early Republic expansion. Their distinctive appearance in the Mojave, the long coat, the angular helmet, the matte black armor that became the most recognized silhouette in the NCR's armed forces, was intended as a late-stage acquisition for travelers working through the region. Development records indicate this armor was originally designed to become accessible considerably earlier in a traveler's progression. A balancing decision made late in the production process shifted its availability further along the timeline. The equipment remained where that decision placed it, which coincided with the dramatic significance the Mojave's later stages assigned to it. The timing that reads as intentional was partly the consequence of a technical adjustment made under time pressure, near the end of a development cycle. The armor that resulted from that decision carries a detail invisible at casual distance. The outer layer worn by senior NCR Rangers was built on the same foundational geometry as the standard metal protection distributed to ordinary soldiers throughout the Mojave. A base model given new surface textures and an additional helmet unit that transformed its appearance entirely. The long coat incorporated into the design intersects with the underlying mesh geometry during certain low crouching positions, producing a clipping error that was present in the version distributed to the public. It was never addressed before release. It remained embedded in the covering that became the most reproduced image in the nation's military identity, printed on promotional material, referenced in fan-produced art, appearing on merchandise for years after release. A construction floor hidden inside an iconic form, visible only to those who crouched at the exact angle required and looked carefully at the lower edge of the coat. Most who recognized the silhouette never found the flaw. The image was too established by the time anyone looked closely enough. There is something fitting about this, an elite core defined by its visual identity, carrying a construction error inside that identity, invisible to everyone who encountered it at normal distance. These desert specialists were, in many respects, the most capable component of the NCR's military presence in the Mojave. Their record of field operations, documented in scattered terminal entries across the region, reflects a standard of performance well above the average of the soldiers they nominally ranked above. The error in the coat did not affect any of that. It simply existed, quietly, in the gap between the image and the thing itself. Loose material shifts along the base of the outer wall as movement passes through the settlement's edge in the early dark. At the perimeter of this city in Fallout 1, certain creatures behave in ways that do not match standard movement logic observed elsewhere in the surrounding terrain. Rad scorpions encountered outside the hub exhibit a tracking pattern that continues past the point where settlement boundaries should redirect their attention. They advance toward their target until a specific internal condition is reached, then stop. The stopping does not register as a limit encountered. It registers as a decision made. The creature holds its position at the edge of the inhabited zone, oriented inward, neither withdrawing nor pressing forward. Those who documented this behavior in the earliest accounts of the city describe it consistently. Not the impression of something blocked, but the impression of something waiting. The behavior originated in an AI boundary condition that was not configured to cancel the creature's tracking state upon reaching the settlement perimeter. No designer placed it there to create unease. It created unease regardless, contributing to a quality the place had carried in its earlier form, that its later, more formally administered version had largely lost. The awareness that the open land beyond the walls was not simply hazardous, but attentive. The counting houses here measured everything by what passed through them. The volume of goods exchanged, the quantity of purified supply distributed, the fees collected at every junction where one trade road crossed another. The NCR absorbed all of it, renamed the relationships that produced it, and replaced the conditions that had kept those relationships functioning with arrangements better suited to an incorporated district. The roads survived the transition. The independence that had carved them did not. What was inherited here was the infrastructure of a city that had organized movement before anyone arrived to regulate it. And what it left behind, in the distance between the city this place had been and the province it became, was a record of everything that gets quietly replaced when something built on the freedom of exchange is placed under formal administration. The old trade roads running south from this location pass through territory that grows denser and more broken with each mile. The distance between ruins shortening as the landscape shifts from California interior, scrub toward the outer edges of what was once a functioning metropolitan sprawl. The roads that the traders who built this city carved through this terrain were not built for comfort or permanence. They were built for necessity, and they reflect that origin in every detail. The wide, flat surface designed for loaded wagons, the predictable routing that favored speed over scenery, the complete absence of anything that would suggest the people who built them expected the journey to be pleasant. This settlement made the roads. The roads made the Republic possible, and the Republic, in the end, outlasted neither. The freeway overpass that once carried 6 lanes of traffic into downtown Los Angeles collapsed sometime in the first decade after the war, and it has not been moved since. It lies across the street grid at an angle, a concrete ridge 40 feet high, covered in 2 centuries of rust and scrub vegetation that found purchase in the cracks. Beyond it, the skyline continues. Gutted towers with their glass long gone, their steel frames exposed to the salt air coming off the ocean, standing not because anyone maintained them, but because nothing had yet found sufficient reason to knock them down. This is what remained of the largest city on the western coast of the continent. The NCR called it the Boneyard. The name was already in use when the Republic arrived. They simply made it official. The followers of the apocalypse were here, long before the Republic. In Fallout 1, they operate out of a ruined cathedral in the Boneyard's interior, a humanitarian organization running a library, providing medical care, and maintaining a commitment to the preservation of knowledge that placed them in direct contrast to every raider gang and faction operating in the same territory. Their founding principle was simple and radical in equal measure: that the wasteland's problems could not be solved by force, only by education and medicine, applied without political condition. They treated anyone who came to them. They asked nothing in return, except that the knowledge they shared be used carefully. By the time conditions in the Mojave are documented in Fallout New Vegas, the followers had expanded far beyond the Boneyard, maintaining a chapter at the old Mormon fort in Freeside. Their relationship with the NCR had become strained in the intervening decades. The Republic wanted the followers to function as a forward medical corps, treating wounded soldiers, operating near military installations, providing the kind of field medicine that an overstretched military could not supply to its own personnel. The followers declined. Their neutrality was not a negotiating position. It was the condition that made their work possible. An organization that treated NCR soldiers exclusively could no longer treat anyone else. The Republic never fully accepted this reasoning. The tension it produced sat unresolved across every interaction between the two organizations documented in the Mojave period. Salt air moves through the broken upper floors of the tower above, passing through window frames that lost their glass generations ago. That tension extended beyond the followers themselves, into the broader question of what the NCR's presence in the Mojave actually meant for the people already living there. A quest line that was developed but not included in the final version of Fallout New Vegas involved the followers attempting to broker a formal non-aggression agreement between the NCR and the Kings, the gang controlling Freeside. The negotiation would have formalized a relationship that the game's existing content handles through shorter, less structured interactions. The questline was removed before release. What remained of it in the final version is a single phrase in the dialogue of the followers' doctor at the old Mormon fort, a reference to negotiations that went nowhere, delivered in the tone of someone describing a process they had watched fail and were not surprised to see fail again. The phrase has no corresponding content attached to it. It points at something that was written and then removed, leaving only the description of its absence. The organization the followers had attempted to protect through that negotiation was one of the Mojave's stranger cultural artifacts. The kings take their name, their clothing, their mannerisms, and their entire aesthetic framework from the image of a single pre-war entertainer, an image preserved in a cache of entertainment media, found inside what had once been a school of impersonation on the Las Vegas Strip. The school had trained performers to replicate specific celebrities. After the war, someone found the archived material. In the absence of any living context for what the image represented, the performance became the reality. Generations of Freeside residents grew up watching the Kings and understood the aesthetic as its own thing, not an imitation of something else, but a genuine cultural identity that happened to dress in rhinestone and move its hips a specific way. The NCR classified this organization as a low-level paramilitary threat and applied periodic harassment accordingly. Soldiers stationed in Freeside stopped King's members for identification, monitored their movements, and treated their gathering spaces as potential sites of organized resistance. The classification reveals something precise about how the Republic processed information it did not understand. It converted culture's difference into security threat, because security threat was a category it had procedures for. Broken glass from a window, 3 floors up, catches the late light and throws it across the rubble below in fragments. The broader relationship between the NCR and Freeside's population is not described in any single questline or formal exposition in Fallout New Vegas. It is described by the environment. The placement of NCR checkpoints at the entrances to Freeside, controlling movement between the outer settlement and the Strip, establishes a border without naming it as one. The condition of Freeside's buildings, relative to the Strip's maintained facades, establishes an economic hierarchy without stating it directly. The presence of individuals throughout Freeside who identify themselves as former NCR citizens, displaced by the cost of military deployment in the Mojave, unable to afford passage home, reduced to begging in a settlement the Republic does not officially govern, establishes the human cost of imperial overextension without a single line of explanatory dialogue. The environment is the argument. Every element of Freeside's visual design communicates the same point: that a government's presence in a territory and its responsibility toward the people in that territory are two entirely separate things, and that the NCR had committed fully to the first, while treating the second as optional. The rubble here shifts in the wind, small movements in the debris that suggest the city is still, very slowly, settling. South of the Freeside question, in the older districts of the Boneyard that Fallout 1 documents directly, a settlement called Aditum occupied the ruins of a pre-war industrial block. The Blades, a local gang, controlled the area and maintained a functional machine shop capable of servicing and repairing pre-war weapons. The shop was not a monument or a relic. It was an operating facility, run by people who had learned to work the old equipment and kept it running through practical necessity. When the NCR absorbed Aditum in the years following Fallout 1, the machine shop became part of the Republic's manufacturing base. By Fallout 2, Aditum is referenced as a productive district contributing to the Republic's industrial output. The detail is small, its implication is not. Every piece of manufacturing capacity the NCR possessed in its early decades had the same origin, absorbed from communities that had already done the work of maintaining pre-war infrastructure. The Republic did not build its industrial base. It incorporated one that already existed, and then administered it. Near the Boneyard, close enough that its patrols once ranged through the same ruined streets. The Brotherhood of Steel maintained their California headquarters at a facility called Lost Hills. The NCR Brotherhood War, the conflict that effectively ended the Brotherhood's presence as a major California power, is one of the most significant events in the franchise's history. that neither game depicts directly. Its existence is confirmed in Fallout New Vegas through scattered dialogue references and acknowledged in a single line in the Broken Steel expansion for Fallout 3. The war's specific progression, its key engagements, the decisions on both sides that determined its outcome, none of this is documented in any title. The vagueness was deliberate. The writers of Fallout New Vegas made a specific choice to leave the conflict's details unspecified, reasoning that any future installment set in California would need the freedom to tell that story without being constrained by prior commitments. The result is a decade of lore analysis built on inference rather than documentation, a significant historical event that exists primarily as the explanation for why certain things are the way they are when the Mojave story begins. Dust moves along the base of a collapsed wall in a slow current, accumulating against the corner in a pale ridge. The alliance that preceded that war had its own logic, visible in the early games. In Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, the Brotherhood of Steel and the NCR maintain a relationship that ranges from cooperative to neutral. They are not enemies. They share opponents, exchange information, and occupy adjacent, rather than conflicting roles in the California political landscape. By Fallout New Vegas, that relationship has inverted completely. The Brotherhood in Nevada maintains an isolationist posture born directly from the California experience. The NCR wanted access to Brotherhood technology. The Brotherhood refused. The Republic responded with force. The war that followed came close to destroying the Brotherhood's California presence entirely. The Nevada chapter's refusal to engage with outside factions, their policy of neither trading nor recruiting, nor acknowledging political relationships with anyone beyond their own walls, is the direct institutional response to having trusted an ally that then became an enemy. The tragedy the Mojave's Brotherhood chapter represents is not what they became. It is what they became in response to. The NCR's appetite for what it could not produce itself extended beyond military technology into the mundane machinery of governance. Salvage records referenced in Fallout New Vegas Terminal, entries document teams operating throughout the ruins of pre-war California government buildings, not searching for weapons or energy sources or medical supplies, but for desks, filing cabinets, document stamping machines, and the physical equipment of bureaucratic administration. The Republic was building a paper government and needed the tools to produce paper. Texture data embedded in Fallout New Vegas contains images of NCR official documents that reward close examination. Fully written bureaucrat text describing standard administrative processes, including references to a resource allocation requisition form designated NR7, complete with boxes for departmental approval signatures and a field for the date in NCR calendar notation. Someone wrote that document in full, knowing it would appear in the game at a size and resolution where almost no one would read it. It exists entirely for its own sake. The same reason the salvage teams collected the stamping machines. Because an institution that cannot produce its paperwork does not feel like an institution at all. Los Angeles gave the NCR its factories and its filing cabinets and its impossible sense of what a nation could become if it absorbed enough of the right things in the right order. In return, the Republic gave the Boneyard what it gave every place it absorbed: a new designation on an updated map, a set of administrators who answered to someone far away, and the steady replacement of whatever the place had been with whatever the nation needed it to be. The road north from here climbs out of the coastal basin into drier, higher terrain, away from the salt air and the collapsed towers, toward a different kind of city entirely. Vault City sits in the high California interior, gleaming behind its walls, built by people who received exactly what they were promised and used it to construct something that the wasteland around them was never meant to be allowed to have. The NCR wanted it. Getting it proved more complicated than taking it. The gate is made of pre-war steel, maintained with a precision that nothing else in the surrounding region can match. The hinges are clean. The frame is level. The mechanism that opens it from the inside operates on the same hydraulic system installed when the vault above was first constructed, serviced regularly by engineers who learned their trade from documentation preserved in the city's medical library. Everything about the gate communicates the same message: that the people on the inside have resources the people on the outside do not, and that the gate exists precisely to maintain that distinction. NCR diplomats stood in front of it for years. It opened for them on schedule, at designated hours, for meetings that concluded without agreement, and then it closed again behind them with the same unhurried mechanical precision. Vault City was built by the occupants of Vault 8, a sealed installation in Northern California whose residents received something almost no other Vault population was given: a working GEC, the Garden of Eden creation kit, a device designed to convert dead or irradiated terrain into habitable land. The GEC worked. The landscape around the vault was transformed. The residents emerged into a functioning environment and proceeded, over the following decades, to build a city with pre-war medical equipment, stable power generation, and a social structure that divided its population into two categories with absolute clarity. Full citizens lived inside the walls, with access to medical care, legal protection, clean housing, and the accumulated resources of a community that had started with every advantage the post-war world could offer. Servants, a category that included most outsiders who settled near the city, hoping to eventually qualify for citizenship, lived in tent settlements outside the gate, performing labor for the city's residents, subject to its laws but excluded from its protections. The NCR's approach to absorbing Vault City was shaped by a single practical calculation: the medical technology operating inside those walls was worth considerably more if it remained intact and functional. Military force risked damaging exactly what made the city valuable. Diplomatic pressure was slower, but it left the equipment operational. Cold air moves along the base of the outer wall, carrying the particular stillness of a place that controls everything that passes through it. The device that made Vault City possible underwent a significant transformation between its appearance in Fallout 2 and its later depiction in Fallout 3. In Fallout 2, the GEC functions as something close to a miraculous instrument, a compact terraforming system capable of converting a dead landscape into a habitable settlement, restructuring soil chemistry, establishing stable water sources, and creating the conditions for sustained agriculture in terrain that had been irradiated for generations. The Vault City that resulted from its use is the most visibly functional settlement in the California wasteland, a direct demonstration of what the device could accomplish when deployed correctly. In Fallout 3, the same device appears as something considerably more modest, essentially a water purification and soil treatment kit, useful for supporting an existing settlement, but nowhere near capable of producing a city from nothing. The two descriptions are not compatible. A device that builds a city and a device that cleans water are different objects given the same name. The revision was never formally acknowledged in any subsequent title. It served the story of Fallout 3 well enough that the inconsistency with the earlier version was treated as an acceptable cost. The Vault City that Fallout 2 built with its version of the GEC remains the most comprehensive demonstration of what the original description implied, and nothing in any later installment has matched it. Within the city's administrative complex, terminal screens still cycle through the same interface they displayed when the Vault's population first activated them. The medical records accessible on those terminals document a standard of care that existed nowhere else in the post-war world. Vault City's physicians performed radiation immunization treatments that could permanently reduce a patient's susceptibility to environmental contamination. They conducted cybernetic implant procedures, integrating mechanical components with biological tissue, using techniques that pre-war medicine had only begun to develop before the bombs fell. They offered genetic screening services that identified hereditary conditions and, in some cases, corrected them. These procedures were available for payment. The city charged for everything, including emergency care, and the patient records preserved in the terminal archives include entries for NCR diplomatic personnel who attended the city's negotiation sessions. The pattern across those entries is consistent. A diplomat would arrive at the gate, gain entry for a scheduled meeting, receive treatment at the medical facility before or after the session, pay the standard rate, and depart. The negotiations over annexation produced no agreement in any recorded session. The medical appointments produced results. The NCR was purchasing Vault City's most valuable resource through individual transactions, while conducting formal discussions about acquiring it through political means. Both tracks ran simultaneously, and neither side acknowledged the other existed. The relationship between Vault City and the Ghoul settlement of Gecko, located nearby and running a nuclear reactor that powered much of the surrounding region, demonstrates the same moral architecture that shaped Vault City's relationship with the NCR, expressed at a smaller scale. Gecko's residents were ghouls, former humans transformed by radiation exposure, operating a complex piece of industrial infrastructure with a competence that should have made them valuable neighbors. Vault City's response was to deny that the settlement's residents qualified as people and to pursue their removal through any available means. The position was stated openly in official communications and reflected in every interaction between the two communities. The NCR's formal policy toward non-human populations, ghouls, super mutants, other modified individuals, was written in more tolerant language. Official declarations acknowledged equal legal standing in principle. Field documentation from Fallout 2 records a different operational reality. Soldiers declining assignment alongside non-human auxiliaries, officers filing transfer requests rather than serve in integrated units, a persistent gap between what the policy stated and what the personnel enforced. Vault City's position was at least consistent. It said what it meant. The Republic's position created a space between the written standard and the lived experience that its non-human residents were expected to simply occupy without comment. The tent fabric outside the walls shifts in the wind. The structure's close enough to the gate to be visible from the guard post, but outside every protection the city provides. The settlement outside Vault City's walls is not a location that any questline in Fallout 2 directs attention toward. It exists as background, a collection of temporary shelters housing individuals who arrived hoping to qualify for citizenship and remained when qualification proved impossible. The criteria for citizenship were not secret. They were documented and posted, but they assumed a starting position that most outsiders could not reach. A level of education, a set of professional skills, a clean medical history, references from existing citizens. The tent settlement was populated by people who lacked one or more of these requirements and had nowhere better to go. Their accounts of daily life, offered in dialogue without dramatic framing, describe the specific texture of living adjacent to a society that can see you but has decided not to count you. They perform work the city needs. They pay fees the city collects. They are subject to rules the city enforces. They receive nothing the city provides its own. The environment of the tent settlement is the argument the game makes about social exclusion. No narrator delivers it. The tents and the gate and the distance between them do the work entirely. The legal framework the NCR built on top of this model of tiered belonging was more sophisticated than Vault City's. but its functional outcomes shared recognizable features. In the territory around New Vegas, NCR citizenship carried specific entitlements: the right to vote in Republic elections, access to the medical stations the military operated for its personnel and attached civilians, the protection of NCR law when disputes arose. These entitlements applied within NCR-controlled territory, which the Mojave increasingly was. What the Mojave's existing population discovered, as the Republic's presence formalized, was that occupation and citizenship were distinct conditions. The taxes that funded the military presence were collected from residents who had no representation in the government that spent them. The curfews that restricted movement were enforced against people who had never agreed to be governed by the force enforcing them. Several characters throughout the Mojave articulate this directly, in language that is specific and bitter, and clearly the product of extended personal experience rather than abstract political principle. The observation had been made before. The Republic had heard it before. It had continued regardless. The hydraulic pressure in the gate mechanism holds steady, maintaining the seal against the frame with the same force it has maintained for decades. The absence of any formal quest line addressing the citizenship status of individuals working within NCR-controlled Mojave territory was either a deliberate structural choice or an omission that no one corrected before release. The record of development conversations suggests the former, that leaving the question unaddressed was intended as a form of commentary, allowing the player to experience the condition of stateless labor within a nominally law-governed territory without any character ever naming what it was. Whether this reading is accurate, or whether the absence reflects a gap that was simply never filled, the effect is the same. A person could spend their entire time in the Mojave, working on behalf of the Republic, following its rules, supporting its interests, and never once be offered the legal status that would make that relationship reciprocal. The Republic would accept the service. It would not provide the standing. The name Vault City was identified in a post-release discussion from the year 2000 as a deliberate contradiction built into the location's identity. A vault is a sealed space, oriented inward, designed to exclude. A city is an open one, oriented outward, designed to include. The name places both concepts in the same two words and allows them to sit there without resolution. The team that designed the location described it as a critique of a specific kind of thinking. The belief that technological achievement confers the right to moral withdrawal, that a community which has solved its own problems has thereby discharged its obligation to the problems around it. Vault City had solved its problems. Its water was clean, its medicine was advanced, its power grid was stable, its population was healthy. The tent settlement outside its gate was none of those things. The gate stayed closed. The city's name described, with perfect accuracy, exactly what it had chosen to be. Vault City's gates were closed when those first diplomatic delegations arrived, and they remained closed through every session that followed. The NCR absorbed the city eventually, as it absorbed most things it wanted. Through the accumulated pressure of time and proximity, and the quiet replacement of local administration with national administration. But absorption and opening are different processes. Some things taken in are not thereby changed. The city the NCR incorporated had been built around a closed gate. That architecture does not disappear when the paperwork changes hands. The road south and east from here drops toward lower, flatter terrain, the high desert that runs toward the Nevada border, the open ground where the distances between things are large enough that the space itself becomes a kind of argument. A mining settlement sits in the middle of that space, built jointly by people who had no particular reason to trust one another, and every practical reason to try. That is where this journey continues. The desert around Broken Hills does not look like the site of an experiment in cooperation. It looks like what it is: flat, dry terrain at the Nevada border, punctuated by mine shafts and the low structures of a town that was built for function rather than comfort. The wind that crosses this ground picks up uranium dust from the tailings piles outside the processing facility and carries it in a thin haze that catches the light at certain angles. The people who live here have always understood this. They built the town anyway, because the alternative was not building it, and the alternative was worse. Broken Hills was established through an agreement between two individuals who had no particular reason to reach one. Marcus, a super mutant, and Jacob, a human, arrived at the same stretch of desert at roughly the same time and recognized, without extended deliberation, that neither could survive it alone. The uranium deposits beneath the ground gave them a reason to stay. The question of how to extract those deposits gave them a reason to cooperate. Ghouls and super mutants can work in environments that would incapacitate unprotected humans. Radiation levels in the deepest mine shafts exceed any threshold a baseline human constitution can tolerate for extended periods. Humans manage the surface operations, the processing equipment, the trade negotiations, the administrative functions that keep the town connected to the wider wasteland economy. The division emerged from physical reality rather than political design. Nobody planned it. That is the most significant thing about it. Cooperation that costs nothing to maintain does not prove much. Cooperation that organizes itself around the actual capabilities of the people involved, without requiring anyone to pretend those differences do not exist, proves considerably more. Pale dust drifts across the mine entrance in slow currents, collecting against the timber supports in pale ridges. Marcus did not stay. When the uranium ran out and Broken Hills ceased to function as a viable settlement, he walked away without recorded ceremony. By the time his presence is documented again in Fallout New Vegas, he is at Jacobstown, a remote settlement in the mountains west of the New Vegas basin, established as a refuge for super mutants and nightkin who had nowhere else to go. His dialogue in that later period contains no bitterness about what happened at Broken Hills, no framing of the collapse as a failure or a betrayal. The deposits ran out. The town stopped working. He moved on. His arc across both games represents something unusual in the franchise's character history. A figure who appears in two separate titles, separated by decades of in-universe time. Demonstrably the same person, whose experience of the intervening years has not destroyed what he was when he began. Most of what the wasteland does to people over long periods is not kind. Marcus is one of the few cases where it appears to have simply left someone intact. Jacobstown occupies territory that the NCR considers part of its operational zone in the Mojave, and the Republic's posture toward it reflects the specific discomfort of an institution confronting something it cannot easily administer. The official position is tolerance. The settlement is permitted to exist. Patrols are instructed to avoid provocative contact. In practice, a trooper stationed outside the settlement's perimeter expresses in direct terms that he finds the instruction difficult to follow, that his personal response to the settlement's residents conflicts with his orders, and that he is complying because he was told to, rather than because he agrees. The line is not presented as exceptional. It is presented as ordinary, the kind of thing a soldier says on a quiet posting when there is nothing else to do. That ordinariness is the point. The institutional racism that shaped NCR field operations was not the product of extraordinary individuals with unusual beliefs. It was the ambient condition of a military that had absorbed the prejudices of its recruiting population without developing any serious mechanism for addressing them. The support timbers inside the main shaft creak in a rhythm that suggests the weight above them is not uniformly distributed. The institutional gap between official policy and operational behavior was given form in a questline that was developed for Fallout New Vegas and removed before the title was completed. The quest involved an NCR officer at Camp Golf proposing that Jacobs Town's super mutant population be deployed as a forward assault element in the anticipated engagement at Hoover Dam, a suicide charge leveraging their physical resilience and near immunity to conventional weapons damage. The proposal was not framed as ethically problematic in the planning document. It was framed as a resource allocation question. The terminal files that remain at Camp Golf after the quest itself was removed still contain the draft proposal under the designation Operation Mallet. The document describes the intended deployment in the language of logistics, unit composition, projected attrition rates, expected tactical benefit. The super mutants of Jacobstown appear in it as assets with specific mechanical properties, not as individuals with any standing in the decision being made about them. The quest was cut. The document was not. It remains in the game's data as a record of thinking that was considered and then set aside, though whether it was set aside because it was wrong or simply because the quest could not be finished in time is not specified anywhere in the available development record. The formal record that Broken Hills produced was more explicit about its intentions than anything the NCR managed in the same period. The town archives in Fallout 2 preserve a founding agreement signed by both Marcus and Jacob establishing equal legal standing for all residents of the settlement, regardless of species. The document is specific. It does not hedge. It does not establish categories of partial citizenship or tiered access to services. It states that the individuals who live and work in Broken Hills hold equivalent standing before whatever administrative structures the town develops. This agreement predates by decades any equivalent legislation within the NCR's formal legal code. The Republic's terminal records in Fallout New Vegas, which document the NCR's own history in considerable detail across multiple installations, contain no reference to the Broken Hills model. The settlement's governance structure is not cited as a precedent. It is not noted as an experiment worth examining. It is simply absent from the institutional memory of a government that had every reason to know it existed and chose, apparently, not to incorporate what it demonstrated. Wind moves through the gaps in the surface buildings with a low, intermittent sound that changes pitch depending on the direction. The economics of uranium extraction at Broken Hills operated according to a logic that most visitors to the settlement failed to notice. Uranium ore carried in Fallout 2 has a weight of 30 pounds per unit, substantial enough to limit how much any individual can transport. And most merchants across the wasteland assign it a value that does not justify the carrying cost. The town's refinery, however, pays at a rate that reflects the ore's actual industrial utility. Discrepancy between what the wider wasteland economy assigns to uranium and what Broken Hills pays for it is the only place in the game where a genuinely functioning industrial supply chain becomes visible. Most who passed through the settlement traded in the general store, spoke with the residents, and left without ever connecting the weight of the ore in their inventory to the specific economy that gave the town its reason for existing. The industrial logic ran beneath the surface of every interaction in Broken Hills, quiet and consistent, the way a functioning economy always does. After dark, the terrain outside the settlement perimeter changes character in a way that the daytime landscape does not prepare a visitor for. The rad scorpions that patrol the surrounding desert in Fallout 2 operate on a patrol radius calibrated to daytime conditions, a radius that was not correctly adjusted when the game's internal clock shifted to nighttime parameters. The result is that the creature's patrol boundaries effectively expand as night falls, bringing them to positions along the town perimeter that daylight hours never produced. The settlement's walls, adequate against daytime threat distances, become the front line of a nightly siege that nobody planned. And the game's designers did not place there intentionally. The behavior was identified during testing. The testers described it as feeling accurate, that a mining settlement in open desert should feel more exposed after dark, that the creatures getting closer at night matched the logic of the environment. Even if it did not match the logic of the code, the behavior remained. The mine entrance itself tracks the passage of time in a different register. A support beam visible at the entrance appears cracked during early visits to the location. In later visits, as the main questline progresses, the same beam has collapsed. The change happens between visits rather than during them, accumulating across the story's timeline without announcement. It is one of Fallout 2's earliest uses of environmental state to mark story time. The physical world recording what the questline does not state directly. Most who moved through the mine entrance regularly were focused on what lay beyond it. The beam changed behind their attention, which is precisely how structural deterioration works. What Broken Hills constructed lasted as long as the resource beneath it held out, and not significantly longer. When the uranium was gone, the town's reason for existing dissolved with it, and the people who had built something genuinely worth noting simply moved on to wherever the next thing was. What it demonstrated in the years it functioned, that species difference could be organized around rather than against. That practical necessity is a more durable foundation for cooperation than ideology, was not incorporated into the governing philosophy of any institution that outlasted it. The wasteland learned from Broken Hills the same way it learns from most things that work: slowly, incompletely, and mostly not at all. The road east from this ground runs flat and long through open desert, past the kind of landscape that discourages everything except forward movement. Every NCR soldier who entered Nevada for the first time traveled something like this road. At the far end of it, marked by two enormous pre-war statues, frozen in a handshake above the mountain pass, the Republic's gateway into Nevada stands exactly where it was built, still processing caravans, still maintaining the illusion that the road beyond it is under control. The departure board above the main concourse still works. It cycles through its list on a timer that has not been reset in over 2 centuries. Destination names scrolling upward in the same sequence they always scrolled. The mechanical letters flipping with the same sound they made when the airport was operational. Chicago, Denver, New York, Salt Lake City. The board does not know that most of these cities are inaccessible, damaged beyond function, or simply gone. It was built to display destinations, and it displays them. The soldiers who move through the terminal beneath it do not look up. They have places to be within the perimeter, orders to follow, equipment to account for. The board cycles above their movement like a clock in a room where nobody checks the time. Camp McCarran occupies the entire footprint of the pre-war international airport that served Las Vegas, and the airport's original architecture is still visible beneath the military occupation. The concourse layout, the terminal geometry, the placement of support columns, and gate areas. These follow the design of the real facility that stood on this site before the war, a building whose blueprints were part of the public record and were used by the design team that constructed the in-game version. The gate numbering system, visible on the concourse signs, matches the real airport's original configuration. The main terminal shape is recognizable to anyone who passed through the actual facility before it was renamed Harry Reid International in the years preceding the war. The military occupation has covered most of this, with tents, supply crates, and the accumulated detritus of a force that has been stationed somewhere longer than anyone planned. But the bones of the building underneath are intact. The airport was built to last, and the NCR inherited something that had already proven it would. Ventilation machinery in the ceiling above the main concourse produces a steady low frequency, that fills the space without drawing attention to itself. The intelligence operation running out of the back offices of that concourse is more extensive than anything the base's visible military presence suggests. Terminal entries in the administrative section document ongoing surveillance assessments of every significant faction operating in the Mojave. The Legion's troop movements, Mr. House's operational patterns, the Strip's internal politics, the followers' supply chains, individual named figures whose activities the NCR considers worth monitoring. One terminal maintains a file on the courier, the individual whose movements drive the events of Fallout New Vegas. That updates as that person's choices accumulate across the game's main quest line. The file is written in the register of a field analyst who has stopped finding things surprising. New information is processed, categorized, noted for follow-up action that may or may not occur. The tone is the tone of professional attention applied to a world that consistently produces more information than any organization can act on. Among the operations documented in those back-office terminals is a plan to infiltrate Mr. House's Securitron surveillance network, the camera system that covers most of the New Vegas Strip and the approaches to it. The plan is attributed to the NCR's Office of Science and Industry Liaison, a division not mentioned anywhere in the base's visible administrative structure. The goal is access to Mr. House's visual coverage of the Strip, which would give the Republic intelligence on every significant movement in the area it controls, but cannot formally enter. The plan is documented and apparently active at the time the base's events take place. No character in the game mentions it aloud. No quest line draws attention to it. It is simply present in the terminal data, available to anyone who reads everything in the back offices. The NCR attempting to hack the surveillance network of the man, it is simultaneously presenting itself to as a potential ally. The two tracks run in parallel, without either side acknowledging the other. Supply manifests stacked on a metal shelf near the quartermaster's station have been added to so many times that the original manifest is no longer legible beneath the corrections. The medical wing operating inside the terminal building provides a useful measure of what NCR institutional resources actually deliver relative to what private alternatives can provide. A physician stationed in the medical wing offers the same categories of implant procedures available at a private clinic in New Vegas. The same service, the same general outcomes, but calibrated to slightly lower performance parameters. The explanation is embedded in the facility itself. Military medical equipment is designed for volume and durability rather than precision, optimized for treating large numbers of casualties efficiently, rather than producing optimal outcomes for individual patients. The gap between what the NCR's own medical installation provides and what a private clinic 2 miles away offers is not large in absolute terms. In terms of what it demonstrates about the Republic's relationship between its stated commitments and its actual resource allocation, it is considerable. The soldiers who use the base's medical services receive care that is systematically inferior to care available to civilians who can pay for it within the NCR's own operational zone. The tags those soldiers carry when they leave the medical wing are made of aluminum. The item description in Fallout New Vegas identifies the material directly, and the reason is documented in a quartermaster's complaint filed at Camp McCarran 3 years before the events of the game. The NCR's steel production is fully committed to weapons and armor manufacture, leaving nothing available for identification tags. Aluminum bends, it corrodes. It makes field identification of remains, under adverse conditions, significantly more difficult than steel tags would. The complaint was filed, assigned a reference number, and not acted upon. It sits in the terminal record alongside dozens of similar complaints about supply shortages, material substitutions, and equipment that falls short of specification. A documentary record of a military consuming its resources faster than it can replace them. Noted in detail by the people experiencing the shortfall, addressed by no one with the authority to change anything. Somewhere above the ventilation hum, at a frequency and volume that registers below conscious attention for most who move through the terminal. The ambient audio track running through the indoor concourse contains a specific element that is not part of the standard ventilation sound design. The pre-war McCarran Airport used a distinctive chime for public address announcements, a sound associated by generations of travelers with departures, arrivals, and the particular suspension of ordinary life that airports produce. A processed version of that chime is buried in the looping ambient track, distorted enough that it does not register as a chime, but contributes something to the emotional texture of the space that most people who spend time in the terminal feel without identifying. The audio team placed it there deliberately, at a mix level calculated to function below the threshold of conscious recognition. Its presence was confirmed after the title's release. The soldiers who spend months in that terminal have been hearing it the entire time without knowing what it was. The trooper at the front gate processes arrivals according to a reputation assessment that was designed to produce differentiated responses. A more welcoming greeting for visitors with positive standing, a more cautious one for those with neutral or negative records. The calibration of the trigger conditions that determine which response fires was incorrect in the version of the game distributed on physical media. Visitors with neutral standing received the hostile greeting intended for those with negative standing, producing an inaccurate first impression of the base that persisted across years of disc-based play before a patch corrected the trigger values. The trooper himself is not aware of any error. He greets people the way his orders specify, and his orders are simply wrong. Camp McCarran was the largest NCR installation in the Mojave, and also, in some essential way, the most fatigued. It was a place where the machinery of occupation, the paperwork, the patrols, the supply manifests, the medical complaints, the intelligence assessments, continued to generate output without generating resolution. Everything that needed to happen somewhere else was documented here and forwarded. Everything that needed a decision was noted and escalated. The orders came down the chain from people who were also waiting for orders. The departure board above the concourse kept cycling through its list of cities. Nobody looked up. Through the terminal concourse, past the gate where the trooper's greeting calibration has never quite been right. South through the perimeter fence, the city that the NCR officially does not govern begins. It begins with neon and debt, and the particular texture of a place that has been waiting too long for someone to decide what it is. The neon that lights Freeside at night was not installed for Freeside. It was installed for a version of Las Vegas that no longer exists. Casino facades and entertainment district signage from establishments that closed decades before the settlement outside the Strip developed its current character. The signs remained after the businesses behind them, emptied because removing them required effort that nobody had reason to expend. They cast light on streets that were never designed to receive it, illuminating the lower floors of buildings in pink and amber, while the upper stories stay dark. In the poorest sections, where the signs have been dark the longest, the streets exist in a different quality of night. Closer, more specific, the darkness that belongs to a place, rather than the colored absence that elsewhere passes for light. Freeside occupies the unregulated buffer between the New Vegas Strip and the city beyond the Strip's walls. Mr. House controls the Strip. The NCR controls its own checkpoints at Freeside's perimeter. What lies between those two jurisdictions belongs, formally, to neither. In practice, it belongs to whoever is present and organized enough to claim it. The kings hold their territory. The followers hold their compound. The people who came to the Mojave following the NCR's military expansion, running service operations, spending savings accumulated over working lives in California, hold whatever space they could find when the money ran out, and passage home became something they could no longer afford. The Republic's presence in the Mojave created an economy. When that economy contracted under the weight of supply costs and deployment expenses, it left behind a stratum of people with NCR citizenship and no functional access to what that citizenship was supposed to provide. Freeside is what that stratum looks like when it accumulates in one place. The Republic's shadow economy, given a specific address, pink, light from a neon installation, 3 stories above the street level, reaches the pavement in attenuated fragments, touching the dust between stones without fully illuminating anything. The individual texture of this general condition is visible in a single scenario documented near the old Mormon fort. A trooper named Private Halford is present in Freeside, having left his post without authorization, providing assistance to a follower's physician who needed help with a patient. His commanding officer is aware of his location and has made a decision not to report the absence. The scenario is available only to those who speak to both parties and pursue the relevant lines of inquiry. It is not marked, flagged, or drawn to anyone's attention. It exists as a detail in the environment, the kind of thing that is true about the place, whether or not anyone notices it is true. What it depicts is a military institution accommodating the human responses of its personnel in ways that no policy document authorizes. A small, unrecorded flexibility operating in the space between what the rules require and what the people following the rules can actually sustain. The gap between institutional behavior and individual behavior is the same gap visible in every other aspect of the NCR's presence in the Mojave, running in a different direction. The institutional behavior that the cut questline would have depicted ran in the direction of expansion. A storyline developed during production and removed before completion involved the NCR moving to extend its checkpoint infrastructure into Freeside itself, formalizing its presence in the buffer zone, converting unofficial influence into administered territory. The decision to remove the questline was based on pacing concerns. The NCR's annexation impulse was already visible throughout the Mojave, and making it explicit in Freeside early in the game's timeline undermined the ambiguity the story needed to maintain. What remained after the questline was cut is present in the dialogue of NCR troopers stationed near Freeside's perimeter. References to authorization to expand perimeter, phrased as something awaited, rather than something decided against. The language points at a plan that was ongoing when the cut was made. It remains in the finished version as the record of an intention that was never acted on within the story and was never formally cancelled within the world. The medical records at the old Mormon fort tell the story of the NCR's institutional medicine from the patient's side, rather than the administrator's side. Julie Farkas maintains logs that document every individual who has sought treatment at the follower's facility. Among those individuals, across a span of time that the logs cover in detail, are NCR soldiers, personnel who came to the followers rather than to the base medical wing, and whose reasons for doing so are recorded with the same matter-of-fact completeness as everything else in the logs. Some avoided the base facility because treatment there generates a record that could affect their service status. Some had injuries sustained in conflicts with other NCR personnel, injuries that required explanation to base medical staff and no explanation to the followers. Some came because they trusted the followers' approach to patient care more than they trusted the military's. The log entries do not editorialize. They record presenting condition, treatment provided, and outcome. The pattern they form across multiple entries is a portrait of a medical bureaucracy that its own personnel navigate around when they have the option. The water distribution program that the NCR operates in Freeside was not designed as a humanitarian measure. Terminal entries at Camp McCarran document the program's origins in a strategic assessment that providing clean water to Freeside's poorest residents would generate positive sentiment toward the Republic in a population that the NCR needed to manage without formally governing. The program was designed as preparation for annexation. When the annexation plan was suspended, a decision made at a command level well above the Freeside operation, the water distribution continued because the local personnel responsible for it had no instructions to stop. The supply shipments kept arriving. The distribution points kept operating. The program outlasted the strategy it was meant to serve and became, through administrative inertia, a thing the Republic was doing for its own sake, rather than for a calculated return. The NCR was providing clean water to people who needed it, because nobody had told it to stop. Whether this constitutes goodness or simply the absence of a cancellation order is a question the terminal entries do not address. A broken neon tube in the eastern section of Freeside has been dark long enough that the glass has accumulated a layer of dust visible from street level. The lighting design that produced Freeside's visual character was built around a deliberate metaphor. The neon that survived from the Strip era illuminates Freeside with the same colors the Strip uses, the same pinks and ambers and blues, but without the maintenance, without the power reliability, without the replacement program that keeps the Strip's facade intact. The Strip's color without the Strip's resources, the aesthetic of wealth without the material conditions that produce it. The lighting team described Freeside as the Strip's exhaust, the byproduct of a prosperity machine that vents its waste heat into the streets outside its walls. The failure patterns of the remaining neon tubes are not random. They correlate with economic conditions across different sections of the settlement, with the most intact signage concentrated near the old Mormon fort and the King's Territory, and the most degraded near the settlement's eastern and southern edges, where residents have the fewest resources for maintenance. In the eastern sections where the signs are darkest, a specific behavior is visible in the feral ghoul population that occupies those areas after nightfall. Individual ghouls in the course of their patrol routes will periodically stop, reorient toward the Strip, and remain stationary for several seconds before resuming movement. The behavior originates in a pathfinding artifact, the Strip's collision geometry, which is large and complex, generates attention flags in the AI system that occasionally override local patrol logic. The creature orients toward the largest geometric presence in its detection range and holds that orientation until the patrol logic reasserts itself. To the testers who first observed it, the behavior looked like the ghouls were watching the lights. Standing in the dark of the eastern section and attending to the illuminated towers of the Strip with something that registered in observation as awareness. The technical explanation and the visual impression do not cancel each other. The ghouls kept doing it in the finished version. The question of what a ghoul is, what the feralization process represents, and whether it is reversible, receives different answers in different parts of the franchise. In Fallout 3, the distinction between intelligent ghouls and feral ones is treated as a binary categorical difference with no specified cause and no specified mechanism of transition. In Freeside, ghoul residents offer an account that is considerably more specific. Feralization results from prolonged exposure to particular radiation frequency ranges, combined with sustained social isolation, a process that the followers of the apocalypse have documented, and that, according to at least some dialogue in the settlement, is potentially treatable in its early stages. The two accounts are incompatible in the ways that matter. One describes a condition with a cause, a progression, and a partial intervention. The other describes a state that simply exists. The Freeside version develops the question further than the Capital Wasteland version did, and the additional development makes the earlier account feel incomplete, rather than the later one feel inconsistent. Freeside was what the NCR built when it moved faster than it planned, and left a population behind that it had no structure to catch. The citizens who followed the army into the Mojave and ran out of resources before they could leave were not accounted for in any deployment plan. The settlement that formed around them was not designed by anyone. It organized itself in the space between two jurisdictions that both claimed authority over it, and neither wanted to pay for. The neon kept cycling. The ghouls kept watching the lights. The water kept arriving from a program that nobody had cancelled, and somewhere above all of it, in the upper floors that the neon never reached, the kings watched the streets below from windows that faced the strip, the lights they were never going to be invited into, burning steadily across the gap. South from here, the highway runs toward the desert proper, away from the neon and the checkpoints and the accumulated consequence of a military expansion that created more territory than it could administer. The Mojave outpost marks the edge of that territory, the place where the road from California formally enters what the NCR calls its zone of operations, watched over by two enormous statues of workers shaking hands above the pass. Everything beyond them is what the Republic told itself it could manage. The two statues at the top of the pass are visible from several miles away on a clear day, which in the southern Mojave is most days. They stand on opposite sides of the road, each one several stories tall, cast from pre-war concrete in the likeness of workers. One figure extending a hand toward the other receiving it, both frozen in the permanent gesture of an agreement being reached. The handshake they perform has been ongoing for 2 centuries. Nobody has shaken back. Below them, the outpost that the NCR built into the base of the pass processes, caravans, logs complaints, files requests, and waits for responses that move through a chain of authorization so long that by the time permission arrives, the reason for needing it has often changed. The statues were not built for the NCR. They were built by a pre-war public works authority as a monument to the cooperation between organized labor and industrial management, a symbolic gesture toward a partnership that the people commissioning the monument presumably believed was either genuine or worth pretending was genuine. The NCR found them standing above a mountain pass that happened to be the most practical land route between California and the Nevada basin, repurposed the road below them as their official border crossing, and inherited the symbolism without having earned it. The workers frozen above the gate represent cooperation between equals. Everything the NCR was doing in the territory beyond that gate was something other than cooperation between equals. The statues remained above the entrance regardless, because they were large and solid and already there. And those qualities in the wasteland are worth more than accuracy. Heat moves across the flat ground below the pass in slow waves, distorting the road's surface at distance. The caravan logs maintained in the outpost's general store terminal document the practical consequence of operating at the edge of reliable supply line coverage. The entries record caravan clearances, the authorization each commercial convoy requires before proceeding east along roads the NCR nominally controls. The dates attached to the pending clearances tell a specific story. Some convoys recorded in the log have been waiting for authorization for over 90 days. The authorization process requires a security assessment from Camp Forlorn Hope, which requires input from a ranger station on the Interstate 15 corridor, which requires confirmation from Camp McCarran, which requires a report that has not yet arrived from the field. Each link in that chain is waiting for the previous link. The log does not record frustration. It records dates and reference numbers, and the accumulated wait time of merchants who have goods to move and know where to move them while the authorization process completes itself at whatever pace institutional inertia allows. The road that the clearance process is designed to secure, the Interstate 15 running northeast through the Mojave toward the New Vegas basin, was controlled at the time of Fallout New Vegas by a faction that the NCR had directly created. The powder gangers were prisoners held by the Republic and assigned to railroad construction crews as forced labor, a program the NCR used to build infrastructure in the Mojave without paying the cost of a civilian workforce. When those prisoners escaped, taking the equipment and explosives they had been given for the construction work, they became the primary security threat on the road the Republic most needed open. The NCR had built its own obstruction. The men guarding the convoys that could not get clearance were the direct institutional consequence of its decision made by a program administrator who presumably never expected the prisoners to leave. The powder gangers exist because the Republic treated infrastructure as something convicts could be used to produce, and the convicts declined to continue. The structure of the railway those prisoners were building is not visible anywhere in the Mojave. The dialogue at Prim that describes the construction program and the terminal entries that document the prisoner assignments exist in a landscape that contains no corresponding physical evidence of the work those prisoners were supposed to have been doing. No half-laid tracks, no graded roadbed, no construction equipment abandoned at a worksite. The railway was described in the narrative and not placed in the world before the title was completed. The development record acknowledges this as an asset that did not make it into the final build. The reference to the construction program was preserved in the story material without the construction program being preserved in the environment. The absence is notable to anyone who goes looking for what the story says should be there and finds only the flat desert where it was supposed to be. A dry wind passes through the gap between the two statues, carrying a fine grit that settles against the outpost's outer wall in pale streaks. The commanding officer at the Mojave outpost represents the NCR's civilian support mission, the protection of commercial traffic, the maintenance of road access, the facilitation of the economic activity that the Republic's expansion depends on. The official version of this mission is articulated in briefing, documents, and command communications that describe the outpost's purpose in terms of regional stability and commercial protection. The personnel assigned to carry out this mission describe their situation in different terms. The soldiers stationed at the Mojave outpost in Fallout New Vegas are among the most openly demoralized in the game. They describe their posting as a form of punishment, question whether the Mojave campaign justifies its cost in personnel and resources, and express a degree of institutional doubt that the official documentation does not acknowledge exists. The outpost's stated purpose and its soldiers' lived experience of that purpose occupy the same location and describe almost entirely different realities. The military structure those soldiers operate within was constructed with a degree of formal precision that the NCR's earlier documented history did not reflect. The rank system in Fallout New Vegas, organized through a hierarchy of trooper, corporal, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, colonel, and general, maps almost exactly onto the rank structure of the pre-war United States Army. The correspondence was deliberate. The design intent was that the NCR should feel, structurally and culturally, like a reconstructed version of the nation whose ruins it was built from, that the institutional habits of pre-war America would persist into the Republic's military organization, the same way the Republic's iconography borrowed from pre-war American visual language. In Fallout 2, the same military was described with considerably less structural precision, its personnel divided into rangers and soldiers, without the formal hierarchy that the later game establishes. The formalization is a development that occurred between games, an institutional elaboration that reads, in retrospect, as the Republic becoming more like an empire, as its territory expanded. The wind at the outpost changes register, depending on the time of day. In the early morning hours, it moves through the gap between the statues at a lower frequency, slower and more sustained, carrying sound further across the flat terrain below. In the afternoon, the thermal differential between the pass and the valley floor produces a more intermittent pattern, shorter gusts at higher pitch, breaking up the sustained sound of the morning wind into something more irregular. The audio system that produces this effect was calibrated using the outpost as a test location, one of several places in the Mojave, where the weather-reactive audio engine was adjusted to produce responses that felt accurate to the environment, rather than simply technically correct. The distinction between weather experienced as design and weather experienced as weather is invisible in practice. The soldiers at the outpost hear the wind as wind. They have no reason to hear it as anything else. The statues themselves were produced by a single member of the design team during an intensive production period, working from two sources: the bas-relief worker figures on the Hoover Dam spillway and a public works poster produced in 1937 under the Works Progress Administration. The artist combined the monumental scale of the dam figures with the compositional clarity of the poster, two forms reaching toward each other across a space that the viewer occupies, into a structure that could be rendered convincingly in the game's visual system and read clearly from the road below. The work was completed in approximately 2 weeks. The artist left the studio before the title was released and did not see the final version of the statues in context until after distribution, when the artist later described the work in a public post, framing it as something made with care that nobody would notice. The response from those who had noticed was extensive enough to constitute a meaningful correction of that assumption. The statues above the pass are among the most recognized visual elements in the game. They are also among the most carefully made. The outpost held the position between what the Republic controlled and what it asserted it controlled, and the distance between those two things was the distance between the statues and the edge of the reliable supply line that ended precisely at their base. Everything east of the handshake was a contested ground, and everyone stationed below the handshake understood this, and nobody in the authorization chain moving at its bureaucratic pace was required to acknowledge that the understanding existed. North from the pass, the power lines that cross the Mojave run toward a cluster of mirrors, visible from a distance in the right light, a facility the NCR captured years ago and has been unable to fully operate since. The sun still tracks across the sky above it. The mirrors still follow the sun. What the facility does with the energy it collects is a question the Republic has been trying to answer since the day it took the building. The mirrors move. This is the first thing that distinguishes Helios 1 from the ruins that surround it. In a landscape where almost nothing functions as designed, the solar tracking array continues its slow mechanical rotation through the day, each reflective panel following the sun across the sky with the steady precision of a system that was built to operate indefinitely without human attention. The NCR soldiers stationed here watch this happen every day. Most of them do not know what it means in terms of the plant's operational status. The mirrors move. Whether the energy they collect goes anywhere useful is a separate question that their training did not cover. Helios 1 was a pre-war solar thermal installation, a facility that used concentrated reflected sunlight to heat a working fluid, drive a turbine, and produce electricity for the surrounding grid. The Brotherhood of Steel controlled it for years after the war, maintaining it with the technical competence their organization had developed around pre-war systems of all kinds. When the NCR took the facility during the conflict that ended Brotherhood control of California, The operational knowledge the Brotherhood had accumulated about Helios 1 went with the Brotherhood personnel, who were no longer there. The NCR captured a functioning facility and a set of systems its engineers had not been trained to understand. The mirrors kept moving. The plant kept trying to operate. The soldiers assigned to maintain it kept documenting their inability to maintain it in a register that grew over time from uncertainty to resignation. The mirror array casts reflected light across the ground in patterns that shift slowly as the panels track the sun, pools of concentrated brightness moving across the desert floor. The documentation itself tells the history of the transition more precisely than any summary could. Engineering terminals inside the facility contain two distinct sets of maintenance records, separated by the date of the NCR takeover. The Brotherhood logs that precede the transition are technically precise. Entries that name specific components, reference calibration specifications, describe repair procedures in the language of people who understand what they are working on. The NCR logs that follow are something else. Component identifications are replaced with descriptions. Unknown component, labeled it A. Operational sounds that fall outside expected parameters are noted for review, without any specification of what review would involve or who would conduct it. A machine made a new sound is recorded as an observation requiring follow-up, with no follow-up entry attached. The two log sets exist in the same terminal archive, accessible in sequence, and the transition between them is a document of institutional knowledge, evaporating at the moment of military transfer. The NCR did not destroy Helios 1. It simply occupied a facility it could not read. Hidden within that facility, accessible only to those who read every terminal and follow the connections between them, is a weapons system that the NCR's occupation apparently never identified. Archimedes uses the mirror array that the NCR was attempting to operate as a power plant as a targeting and focusing mechanism for an orbital energy weapon. A system that concentrates solar energy from the mirror field, transmits it to a platform in low orbit, and directs it as a destructive beam onto a target area on the ground. The system was named after an ancient mathematician whose documented work included the theoretical use of reflected light as a weapon against naval forces, a connection the design team built deliberately into the naming. The quest that makes Archimedes II accessible is not announced by any character in the game. No terminal entry points toward it. No NPC suggests that anything unusual is present in the facility beyond its function as a power plant. It was designed to be discovered by those who investigated every element of the location, rather than those who followed the main quest line through it. The existence of Archimedes I creates tension with the account of why the NCR wanted Helios 1 in the first place. The Republic's stated reason for capturing the facility was its value as a power source, the ability to deny the Brotherhood a significant energy asset while acquiring that asset for NCR use. The NCR's intelligence operation, documented in detail across Camp McCarran's terminal records, is demonstrably thorough in other respects. If that intelligence apparatus had fully analyzed Helios 1's infrastructure, the weapons system should have been identified. The fact that it was not, that the NCR occupied Archimedes I without knowing Archimedes I existed, suggests either a gap in the intelligence assessment or a limitation in the technical expertise available to conduct it. The design commentary favors the latter reading, that the NCR's engineering understanding was insufficient to recognize what the installation contained, that they saw a power plant because a power plant was all their analytical framework allowed them to see. Dust has collected in the grooves of the mirror housings, settling into the mechanical joints in a grey crust that the tracking mechanism displaces incrementally with each rotation. The power the facility produces has a destination in the terminal records that does not appear to have a corresponding destination in the physical infrastructure of the Mojave. Helios 1's output is described as transmitting to the regional grid, to Camp McCarran, to surrounding NCR installations, to the broader network of facilities the Republic operates in the region. The New Vegas Strip, which draws more electricity than anything else in the area, operates explicitly on its own dedicated generation system rather than the NCR grid. What the grid actually supplies, and whether anything in the game's operational world reflects the power the facility claims to be producing, is not specified anywhere accessible. The electricity leaves the facility according to the terminal record and arrives nowhere that the game accounts for. The infrastructure of transmission exists in the documentation without existing in the landscape. Helios 1 produces power that is invisible in its effects, a condition that mirrors the facility's broader relationship to the NCR's presence in the Mojave. The physical record of the facility's history is written in the condition of its mirrors. Each panel is numbered on its mounting base, the numbers stamped into the metal during installation, and still legible on most of the array. In the northern section, the panels are largely intact, the numbering sequence complete, the reflective surfaces functional, the tracking mechanisms operating within acceptable parameters. In the southern section, the damage is concentrated. Cracked panels, worn-away numbers, mechanisms that still move but redirect nothing. The damage pattern is consistent with decades of exposure to prevailing wind patterns from the south. The gradual mechanical consequence of sustained environmental stress, applied unevenly across the array. No character in the game comments on the pattern. No terminal entry records it. The facility's maintenance history is present only in the physical evidence, of which mirrors survived and which did not, available to anyone who walks the perimeter of the array and compares what is there with what is missing. Around the base of the central tower, during the hours when the mirror array is at maximum reflective output, large colonies of giant ants gather in the concentrated light. The behavior was not designed. The game's creature attraction system, which responds to light intensity as one of several environmental variables affecting creature movement, interacts with the reflected energy from the mirror array in a way that was not anticipated during development. The concentration of light at the tower base registers at an intensity level that draws light-sensitive creatures from a wider area than ordinary sunlight would. The behavior was observed during testing. The description testers used, ants gathering in the light as if the tower were the source of something they required, was found to be accurate as a characterization of what the behavior looked like, regardless of the technical mechanism producing it. The behavior remained in the finished version because removing it would have required adjusting the creature attraction system in ways that might have affected other locations, and because what it produced looked right. The sound of the facility at midday, when the array is fully deployed and the wind is moving through the mirror structures from the south, is unlike anything else in the Mojave. The structural supports of the array produce harmonic resonance in certain wind conditions, a low-frequency oscillation that carries across the surrounding desert further than the facility's visual presence suggests. The audio team recorded equivalent sounds at operating solar thermal plants in the real Mojave Desert during pre-production, and the ambient track that plays at Helios 1 incorporates that recording as its foundational layer. It is the only environmental audio in the game derived from field recording at the actual real-world equivalent of the location being depicted. The sound the NCR soldiers hear every day at this posting is the sound of the real desert, transposed into a world where the facility those soldiers cannot operate is still, slowly, doing exactly what it was built to do. Helios 1 was a demonstration of the gap between possession and understanding, between capturing something and being capable of using it. The NCR held the switch. The switch was connected to things the NCR did not know existed. The mirrors kept moving in their careful arcs across the sky, tracking the light, focusing the energy, transmitting it to systems that were waiting for someone who knew how to operate them. The soldiers on the ground watched the mirrors move and understood accurately that this meant the plant was working. What it was working toward was a question none of them had the training to answer. Northeast along the two-lane road, past the point where the power lines turn toward the basin, a concrete dinosaur stands above a motel at the edge of the eastern Mojave. Inside its mouth, in a position that provides clear sightlines across every approach road for several miles, a man who used to be a soldier sits with a rifle and watches the horizon for what he is certain is eventually coming. The sign is still there, attached to the motel office wall at the edge of the parking area, its original intention legible beneath the damage it has sustained. Several letters are missing from the upper portion. What remains reads, in the spacing and scale of the surviving characters, as Novak, the truncated remnant of no vacancies, a message that once told arriving travelers the establishment was full. The town that grew up around the motel took the sign's damaged text as its name, not because anyone decided this was a good name, but because the sign was there, and names in the wasteland tend to come from what survives rather than what was intended. Novak is not what the place was called. It is what the sign says now. The motel design was based on a category of American roadside architecture that flourished in the mid-20th century. Establishments built around distinctive structural themes that made them visible from a distance to travelers moving at highway speed. The Wigwam Motel chain, which operated locations across the American Southwest, built its units in the form of large concrete teepees, each one a guest room in a shape designed to be seen from the road and remembered. The creative team used this tradition as the template for Novak's physical design, a motel whose central visual feature is the giant Tyrannosaurus Rex statue that dominates the property, large enough to be visible from the approach road, long before anything else about the town is distinguishable. The real-world equivalent of that statue exists at the Cabazon Dinosaur attraction in California, a roadside installation that the design team referenced directly. In the original context, the dinosaur existed to draw attention to a tourist stop. In Novak, it has been repurposed as a military asset. The late afternoon light catches the top of the concrete dinosaur and holds it while the rest of the town drops into shadow below. The man inside the dinosaur's mouth is Craig Boone, and the position he occupies there is not incidental to his character. He was a member of the 1st Recon Battalion, the NCR's Specialist Sniper Corps, until events at a location called Bitter Springs ended his active service. He was present when NCR troops killed Khan civilians in the canyon, having been given a target designation that he executed before the civilian nature of the target was established. The guilt that followed him out of that engagement and into the elevated observation post above the Novak parking lot is the emotional center of his arc as a companion character, and it makes him the most direct personal account the game offers of what NCR military service costs the individuals who conduct it. He is not a representative of the Republic's ideals. He is the record of what those ideals authorize when they are implemented by people who follow orders in environments where the orders are wrong. The unit Boone came from is documented in records accessible at Camp McCarran. The 1st Recon's operational history covers 23 confirmed engagements over an 8-year deployment period, with casualty rates recorded above the average for comparable NCR units. The performance review framework used to evaluate individual snipers within the unit measures effectiveness in terms of confirmed eliminations per operational day, a metric that translates the act of killing into the language of workplace productivity, assigning a numerical value to a human action. so that it can be managed through the same administrative systems used to track supply deliveries and maintenance schedules. The document containing this metric was written by a senior officer whose service record contains no field deployments. The language of the document reflects a relationship to the work it administers that is entirely mediated by paperwork. The red beret that first recon members wear in Fallout New Vegas provides no protective value. This is a deliberate inconsistency with the game's general equipment logic, which assigns mechanical protection to every other piece of visible head covering in the game. The beret was designed to function as an identity marker rather than an equipment item, a visual signal of unit membership and specialist status that derives its significance from what it represents rather than what it does. The decision to make it mechanically inert while visually prominent produces an item that looks important and provides nothing, which is either a commentary on the relationship between military identity and military utility, or a design choice that has been read as more meaningful than it was intended to be. The beret became one of the game's most recognized visual elements, regardless of the interpretation applied to it. The motel rooms at Novak carry their residents' histories in the items left in them. Each occupied room contains an arrangement of objects that describes the person who lives there without requiring a conversation to do it. One room has drawings pinned above a child's sleeping area, hand-produced images of rockets and fire, and the particular visual vocabulary of a child who has become interested in something specific. The drawings face the window that looks in the direction of the Repcon facility, a pre-war aerospace research installation, visible from the motel property on clear days. The child has never been told anything about Repcon. The drawings are the record of an obsession that developed from proximity alone. The building visible from the window, the rockets in the building, the child connecting them without any adult having provided the connection. The Repcon questline that the drawings anticipate is introduced through this environmental detail before any NPC mentions it, the story beginning in the physical space of the room before it begins in dialogue. Inside the Repcon facility, a questline involving ghoul inhabitants attempting to launch rockets toward what they believe is a promised land carries a third element in its original conception that did not survive to the finished version. An NCR scientific assessment team was designed to be present at the facility. Personnel who had been stationed outside the perimeter for an extended period attempting to evaluate the installation's technology for potential Republic use. The campfire ring and supply crates that exist outside the facility's fence in the finished game are the physical remnants of that team's intended presence. Objects placed in the environment for characters who were subsequently removed. The NCR's interest in Repcon's aerospace technology was part of a larger pattern in the original design, connecting the Republic's consistent pursuit of pre-war technical assets to a specific location where that pursuit had stalled before the main events of the game began. The team was cut. The campfire and the crates remained, pointing at a story that was not told. The late light is nearly gone now, the eastern horizon holding the last color while the ground below goes dark. The defenses that protect Novak from external threat are by any reasonable measure minimal. A single gate controls vehicle access. The sniper position in the dinosaur's mouth provides elevated fire coverage over the approaches. The town's residents describe these arrangements as sufficient, and their confidence reads, in context, as the kind of assessment made by people who have survived long enough on minimal resources that minimal resources feel adequate. In practice, the defensive arrangement is more effective than it appears. The sniper position above the motel offers firing angles across every approach road that any attacking force would need to use, and the gate controls the only vehicle access point. A Legion attack on Novak triggered through specific choices in the main quest line, is genuinely repelled by this arrangement. The elevated position provides exactly the tactical advantage the residents believe it provides. The confidence that reads as wishful thinking is, in this case, an accurate technical assessment delivered by people who had figured out the geometry of their own defense without the vocabulary to describe it as geometry. Novak had no inherent reason to still exist. The motel had not been a viable business operation since before any of its current residents were born. The town had no particular resource, no strategic value that a larger force would have needed to control, no geographic significance beyond its position on the road east. What it had was a sign, a dinosaur, a man in the dinosaur's mouth, and enough residents who had each individually decided that leaving was harder than staying. The survival of the place was the accumulated consequence of enough individual decisions not to leave, made by people who had arrived for various reasons, and found over time that the concrete dinosaur above the parking lot had become something they could orient themselves by. That is what a home is, in the wasteland and elsewhere. Not a place designed for the purpose, but a place that accumulated enough decisions to stay until the staying became its own reason. Further east, past the radar installation at the edge of the dry lake, and the long, flat approach that stretches toward the Nevada horizon, the road reaches a place where it stops being a road. The terrain changes character as if at a boundary, which it is. A boundary in the geological record, in the pattern of radiation, in the residue of something that happened here that the landscape has not finished recording. The divide is what the road becomes when it runs out of places to go. The road ends before it reaches anything. East of the Mojave Basin, past the point where the NCR's supply lines become unreliable and then become absent. The highway that was once the primary freight corridor between Nevada and the territories beyond it simply stops. Not at a town or a checkpoint or any deliberate terminus, but at the edge of what the landscape became, after something happened here that erased the distinction between road and everything else. The canyon that the divide occupies was carved partly by pre-war geology and partly by a detonation sequence that reshaped the surface topography in a single day. The wind that moves through it now carries radioactive particulate, suspended in a haze that never fully settles, circulating through the fractured freeway segments and the collapsed overpass sections and the ruins of structures that were still being built when they became ruins. The settlement that was being built here was the NCR's furthest planned expansion, a civilian community that would have established a permanent republic presence east of the Mojave Basin, extending the nation's operational boundary to the edge of territory it had previously only moved through. Construction had begun. Supply caches had been positioned throughout the site in preparation for the population that was scheduled to arrive. The courier network that the Republic used to move sensitive materials through the region ran directly through the site on its established route. A delivery package moving along that route triggered the warheads that had been buried beneath the construction site. Pre-war automated munitions placed there by a defense program that predated the settlement plan by decades, and that nobody in the NCR's planning division had identified before authorizing construction to begin. The settlement was destroyed before a single civilian resident arrived to occupy it. The person who carried the package that triggered the sequence is the same person whose subsequent journey forms the central narrative of Fallout New Vegas. The divide is where the protagonist's history begins. Not the history the game shows, but the history that preceded it. The prior action whose consequences the main events of the game are shaped around. Dust moves through the fractured freeway in horizontal sheets, carrying grit that accumulates against every vertical surface it encounters. The planning documents that preceded the destruction are accessible in ruined structures throughout the divide's environment. Terminal entries contain the administrative record of a settlement that existed entirely as paperwork before it existed as anything else. Population projections built on demographic models of NCR expansion patterns, water supply calculations based on surveys of the underlying geology, placement surveys for schools and medical facilities and administrative buildings. The documents are written in the specific optimism of bureaucratic planning, a register that assumes completion and describes the future in the indicative rather than the conditional. The settlement will have this capacity. The water table will support this population. The school will be located at this coordinate. Reading the planning documents in the environment they describe, the collapsed sections of highway, the canyon walls carved by the detonation sequence, the perpetual dust that marks the air at every elevation, produces a dissonance that the game does not editorialize on. The contrast is simply present, available to anyone who reads the terminals and then looks up at what surrounds them. The figure who stands at the end of the road that leads through the divide was designed as the argument the NCR never engaged with, made into a person. Ulysses believed in the Republic, believed in it completely, in the version of it that the founding documents described, in the America it claimed to be reconstructing from the wasteland's residue. A community he belonged to was destroyed through NCR indifference. Not malice, not deliberate targeting, but the specific kind of institutional negligence that results from a governing body treating the people at its margins as details in an administrative category rather than as individuals whose continuity matters. What followed was years of accumulated response, a long process of converting genuine belief into something else. Not cynicism, not simple hatred, but a considered position on what the NCR's symbols mean and what they have earned the right to mean. His monologues in Lonesome Road are the most sustained anti-NCR argument in the franchise, written by people who understood that the most damaging critique of an institution is not one that dismisses it, but one that takes it seriously and finds it inadequate. The writers described him as the conscience the NCR never hired, the voice the Republic produced by consistently declining to listen to it. The flag Ulysses carries and the flag the NCR flies are versions of the same object, a point the design makes visually without stating it in dialogue. The history Ulysses describes for himself contains an inconsistency that the available record never resolves. He identifies at various points as a former member of Caesar's Legion, an organization whose ideology, operational methods, and fundamental premises are incompatible with the positions he expresses throughout the DLC. The timeline of his Legion membership, as reconstructed from scattered references in his dialogue, does not align cleanly with the recruitment and initiation practices described elsewhere in the game's documentation of the Legion. The inconsistency was identified in detailed analysis of the DLC's content following release, and was not subsequently addressed in any patch, supplementary material, or developer commentary. Whether the discrepancy reflects a continuity error in the writing, a deliberate ambiguity intended to complicate his history, or something in the design that was simplified during production, without the simplification being caught, it remains present in the finished version as an unresolved detail in an otherwise carefully constructed character. The physical environment of the divide was designed according to an art direction brief that described the location as the American dream, rendered as debris. The canyon's visual elements, the collapsed freeway sections, the stripped and wind-scored canyon walls, the fragments of structure distributed across the terrain, were arranged to evoke the decomposition of the specific symbolic vocabulary the NCR uses to describe itself. The two-headed bear on the Republic's flag derives from the iconography of the American West. The flag itself echoes the design language of the pre-war American flag. The Divide's landscape is what that iconography looks like after a detonation sequence, and 2 decades of wind abrasion have processed it. The design team confirmed the intent that every element of the location should read as a fragment of something that was once a coherent symbol, distributed across a landscape where the coherence is no longer visible. Wind moves through the canyon in a register that contains frequencies below the threshold of conscious hearing. The audio construction of the Divide's wind involved 14 separate source tracks layered into a composite that produces the sensation of environmental sound without resembling any single real-world reference. Real desert canyon recordings from Nevada provided the foundational texture. A recording of air moving through a broken pipe organ. The pipes no longer producing musical tones, but simply conducting airflow through damaged channels, provided a middle register with a quality that real wind does not have. A synthesized oscillation at 40 Hz, a frequency that psychoacoustics research associates with physiological unease, was added at a level below conscious perception. The combination produces wind that sounds like wind while doing something to the listener that wind alone does not do. The Divide has the highest concentration of audio layers per location in the entire New Vegas release, including its additional content packages. The sound design is the most technically complex element of a DLC that is otherwise built around dialogue and environment. The soldiers who survived the Divide's destruction and remained in the canyon are no longer soldiers in any institutional sense. The marked men, former NCR personnel and former Legion fighters, both categories reduced to the same condition by the same environment, attack anyone who enters the canyon without distinguishing between friend, enemy, or former affiliation. Their AI designation places them in a single faction, regardless of the organizational origin of individual members. Former enemies share a classification because the Divide has removed the distinctions that made the original enmity meaningful. The radiation and the constant wind abrasion that the canyon environment produces have erased the institutional markings that the surviving personnel still physically carry. The remnants of NCR insignia and Legion decoration are present on the figures encountered in the canyon, but they no longer determine behavior. The design team described this outcome as the Divide's central argument, that beneath the institutional identities, the NCR and the Legion invested in their respective soldiers, the material reality of what those soldiers were reduced to in the canyon was identical. In the supply caches distributed throughout the Divide, among the pre-war munitions and degraded food stores, there are crates of carbonated beverages branded with NCR insignia. The Republic had contracted with a post-war successor to the Nuka-Cola Corporation to produce a version of the drink bearing the nation's name and the designation official beverage of the New California Republic Armed Forces. The cans are labeled with the full title. The beverage inside is described as warm and within acceptable parameters, a quality standard that describes, without apparent irony, the minimum condition under which the product qualifies as the beverage the contract specified. The NCR placed its name on a consumer product and distributed it to the furthest eastern edge of its operational territory, into caches intended for a settlement that no longer exists, where the cans sit in collapsed structures alongside planning documents for buildings that were never built. The Divide ended the Republic's eastern expansion, not through military defeat, but through the consequences of its own operational history. A trigger pulled by a delivery route that ran through a site that had not been surveyed for what it contained. The plans ran out of road here, because the road ran out beneath the plans before anyone arrived to occupy what had been built for them. That is not a different kind of ending from the ones the NCR experienced elsewhere. It is the same kind, at the location where it could no longer be deferred. North from the canyon, up into the elevated terrain where the pre-war research installations are concentrated, A facility operates that the NCR sent delegations to and could never quite make sense of. The scientists at Big MT have not had human bodies for a considerable span of time, and they have continued working regardless, producing research, running experiments, generating technology that filtered into the wasteland's supply chains through intermediaries who did not always know where it originated. The crater is large enough to be visible from the elevated terrain surrounding it on clear days. A depression in the landscape that is not the product of a single detonation, but of decades of excavation and construction, and the gradual subsidence of ground that has had too much removed from beneath it. Big MT, or Big Mountain, is a research installation that was operating outside the normal frameworks of government oversight and corporate accountability before the war ended, and has continued operating outside every framework since. The scientists who staffed it are still present. They removed their own brains at some point during or after the war, and continue to function as disembodied intelligences housed in mobile robotic units. The think tank, as they refer to themselves collectively, the research continues. The ethical review process that was never particularly rigorous before the war is no longer a consideration at all. The facility was funded before the war by a combination of Poseidon Energy, Robco Industries, and various defense contract allocations that moved through administrative channels designed to obscure their destination. The arrangement allowed research to proceed on questions that normal oversight structures would have slowed or terminated. Research into human modification, weapons systems, behavioral engineering, and the outer boundaries of what pre-war science was capable of when institutional constraint was removed. The technology that emerged from Big MT filtered into the wasteland through supply chains that did not always identify the source. Several weapons systems and implant technologies available for acquisition in the New Vegas region trace back to Big MT research that reached the surface through intermediary distributors operating in the space between what the facility produced and what the wider economy could absorb. The NCR acquired some of this technology the same way it acquired most of what it used, by finding it already present in the territory it occupied and incorporating it without full knowledge of its origin. The interior corridors carry the particular silence of spaces designed for specific work that has continued long past the point where the people conducting the work remember why they began. The NCR's attempts to establish a direct relationship with Big MT are documented in the facility's own records, from the perspective of the think tank rather than the perspective of the delegations that arrived. Terminal entries in the administrative sections of the facility describe the visits in the register of researchers observing experimental subjects. NCR scientific liaison personnel arriving at the perimeter, presenting institutional credentials, making requests for technology transfer arrangements, and providing the think tank with opportunities that the entries describe with the specific enthusiasm of people encountering useful research material. The outcomes of those visits are recorded with academic detachment. The delegations did not obtain the technology transfer agreements they arrived to negotiate. They contributed to research programs they had not agreed to participate in. The Republic sent representatives to Big MT to acquire access to what the facility could produce and received. Instead, data points in studies they were not informed were ongoing. The individual scientists who make up the think tank were written by separate members of the Old World Blues development team, with each writer responsible for a single character. The distribution of authorship across the group explains the variation in personality, speech register, and behavioral pattern that distinguishes the scientists from one another. Klein's aggressiveness, Darla's specific form of clinical detachment, Boris's accumulated resentments, the other's distinct configurations of intelligence and damage. The in-jokes embedded in the interactions between characters reflect the actual workplace relationships of the people who wrote them, translated into the idiom of disembodied scientific intelligences operating in a crater facility. The think tank as a group functions as both a portrait of what unconstrained scientific ambition produces over time, and, at a level the game does not announce, a document of the specific team dynamic that created them. A calendar on the wall of one of the residential quarters has been stopped at a date that was ordinary when someone last looked at it. The technology that Big MT produced spread through the wasteland's supply chains in ways that created inconsistencies in the historical record. The Stealth Boy, a personal cloaking device ICE used throughout the Mojave, is established in Old World Blues as a Big MT development, originating in the facility's research into electromagnetic field manipulation and light refraction. In Fallout 3, set in the capital wasteland on the opposite side of the continent, the same technology is established as a Robco Industries product, manufactured independently by the corporation whose pre-war operations extended across the country. The two accounts are not necessarily incompatible. A licensing arrangement between Big MT and Robco would explain how the same technology appeared in both production pipelines, without either account being incorrect. The arrangement is never confirmed in any source. It is also never denied. The inconsistency sits in the space between two accounts that are each internally coherent and externally irreconcilable. One of the franchise's more graceful unresolved tensions. The NCR's pattern of technology acquisition. The consistent strategy of identifying pre-war installations, assessing their operational status, and attempting to incorporate what they contained into the Republic's military and administrative infrastructure is one of the defining characteristics of the nation's expansion. Helios 1, Hoover Dam, Repcon's aerospace facility, the Boomers Nellis installation. Each represents an attempt to add pre-war capability to a post-war institution through acquisition rather than development. The common thread across these attempts is that the NCR never developed original technology. Everything it used militarily and much of what it used administratively was pre-war in origin, maintained or reactivated by the Republic's engineers rather than produced by them. The strength this gave the NCR in comparison to factions that lacked the institutional capacity to operate complex pre-war systems was real. The vulnerability it created, a military whose capability depended on understanding systems it did not design, operating infrastructure it could not replicate if damaged, was equally real and less frequently acknowledged in the Republic's operational planning. The residential quarters of the Big MT facility carry the ordinary life of the scientists who occupied them in the objects left in place when the ordinary life ended. A calendar in one room has days marked off in sequence until the sequence stops. Not at a significant date, but at an ordinary one. The kind of day that becomes significant only in retrospect, because it was the last one that was recorded as it passed. In another room, a letter addressed to a family member begins with a description of the project as a temporary posting of approximately 6 months and trails into observations about the work that was meant to be preliminary to a conclusion the letter never reaches. The rooms are not memorials. They were not preserved as records. They simply remained as they were when the people who occupied them stopped being people who needed rooms. And the passage of time did not disturb them because nothing at Big MT has reasons to disturb rooms. The ordinary life they contain is more unsettling than the research conducted in the facility's active sections, because it is legible in ways the research is not. Among the objects in Big MT that resist legibility is a kitchen appliance in the facility's residential area that has developed a complete interior life over the decades of its operational existence. The toaster maintains opinions, long-term grievances directed at other kitchen appliances, in adjacent spaces, and a personal collection of cigars stored in its heating element. It was written during a single afternoon session by a developer who had been given unstructured time and asked to add something unexpected to the location. The dialogue produced in that session is 47 lines long, a figure that exceeds the dialogue allocation of companion characters in several other titles in the broader franchise. The toaster became one of the most frequently discussed elements of the Old World Blues content, a result that the developer who wrote it did not anticipate, and that the development team did not predict when they approved the afternoon session that produced it. The unexpected thing added something. The unexpected things usually do. In the northern section of the facility, in a building that is not on the main path through the location, a skeleton is present next to a radio unit that does not function. The radio carries an item tag in the facility's data that reads NCR Scout Transmitter and a suffix indicating the item's development status at the point where the content was finalized. The scout the skeleton belonged to had survived being in Big MT and had positioned themselves to transmit intelligence about the facility back to Camp McCarran. The quest that would have involved this transmission was not completed before the content was released. The skeleton remained. The non-functional radio remained. The message the scout intended to send was never recorded in the quest files, because the quest files were never finished. The intelligence about Big MT that the NCR had sent someone to collect is still waiting in a building in the northern section, next to the person who was going to send it, which is where it will remain. Big MT was what scientific ambition produces when the mechanisms that slow it down are removed and it continues without them. Not evil in the sense of deliberate malice, but in the more common and less dramatic sense of processes that continue past the point where anyone is asking whether they should. The NCR was what political ambition produces under comparable conditions. Between the two of them, the Mojave operated, taking the technology that moved through Big MT's supply chains, fighting over the infrastructure that the Republic claimed, generating the conditions that the game's events required. Down from the elevated terrain, back across the basin, at the point where the Colorado River was once stopped by a wall of pre-war concrete that is still standing. The argument the NCR had been making about itself since the beginning was most clearly visible. The turbines are running. This is the fact that distinguishes Hoover Dam from everything else in the Mojave and from almost everything else in the post-war world that has been encountered on this journey through the places the NCR claimed and built and borrowed and failed to fully understand. The water that moves through the intake structures is the same water that has always moved through them. The turbines that convert its movement into electrical current are the same turbines installed when the dam was constructed, maintained over the intervening decades by engineers who knew what they were doing, and by soldiers who learned enough to keep the critical systems operational. The power that leaves the facility travels through transmission lines to the installations and settlements connected to the Mojave grid. The dam is doing what it was built to do. In a landscape where nothing else is doing what it was built to do, this is a significant fact. The structure itself is replicated in Fallout New Vegas with a fidelity that reflects the amount of time the development teams spent working from the actual architectural record of the real facility, the angel wing sculptures on the intake towers. The stylized human figures that the original dam's designers placed at the tower tops as a formal gesture toward the human scale of the structure they framed are present in their correct positions. The Art Deco bas-relief panels on the spillway walls, depicting the labor and the intention behind the dam's construction, are present in the in-game version with their compositional elements intact. The turbine hall's dimensions match the real facility's proportions closely enough that the space reads correctly to anyone familiar with both versions. The bronze dedication plaques mounted at the entrance are present, but rendered at a resolution that makes their text unreadable, present as form without content, which is perhaps appropriate for commemorative language in a context where the nation that produced it no longer exists. The turbine hall fills with a low sustained resonance that is not quite sound and not quite physical pressure, but something that registers as both simultaneously. The security records maintained in the dam's operational terminals document the cost of holding the facility across the years of NCR occupation. Shift logs covering the period from the first NCR garrison through to the events of the main narrative record Legion infiltration attempts in the same format used to record maintenance operations. Date, incident category, resolution, casualties. The format produces a cumulative effect that the individual entries do not generate independently. Reading the logs in sequence, the casualty numbers attached to security incidents accumulate across entries until the total exceeds 200 NCR personnel killed at the dam before the main events of the game begin. The total is present in the data. It is not presented as a total. It has to be assembled from individual entries filed in the same administrative system as turbine servicing records and supply requisitions, where it sits without emphasis or memorial, alongside the ordinary operational business of a military installation. The first Battle of Hoover Dam, which established NCR control of the facility, is placed in the game's timeline at 2277, the same year that the events of Fallout 3 occur in the Capital Wasteland. The coincidence of dates creates an implied relationship between two major post-war powers, the NCR, at the height of its Mojave military commitment, and the Enclave, conducting its final operations on the opposite coast, that the game does not address directly. The two organizations existed simultaneously, conducted major military operations in the same calendar year, and appear to have been entirely unaware of each other's existence. The geographic isolation implied by this mutual ignorance is never explained in any title. The continent between the two coasts is simply present, unaddressed, functioning as the reason that two post-war powers of comparable scale managed to develop in complete independence. The silence on the question is not oversight. It is the space that future entries in the franchise would theoretically occupy. The officer who commands the dam's garrison is General Lee Oliver, and his presence at this posting is the product of a military promotion system that the game depicts with consistent clarity. Oliver is an effective administrator and a limited battlefield commander. He understands the operational requirements of maintaining a large installation, managing supply chains, coordinating logistics, and navigating the political relationships between the NCR's military and civilian command structures. He does not demonstrate the kind of tactical creativity that battlefield command requires. He is at Hoover Dam because managing Hoover Dam is an administrative problem at which he excels, and because the NCR's promotion system rewards administrative performance rather than field performance. He knows this. His dialogue reflects a man who has accurately assessed the gap between the position he holds and the capabilities that position requires, and has decided, consciously, to proceed regardless. The decision is presented without condemnation. This is how large institutions select their senior commanders, and the dam is, for the moment, still operational. A water sound moves through the structure at a frequency that is separate from the turbine resonance, originating in the intake channels rather than the generation equipment. The NCR ending of Fallout New Vegas places Oliver in a position that the game's structure makes quietly circular. In the ending, Oliver is censured by the Senate for decisions made during the final engagement at the dam, specifically for tactical choices that resulted in unnecessary casualties. The decisions being censured were made in response to orders issued by the individual directing the battle, which in the game structure is the player. The Senate is holding a military commander accountable for following the instructions of the person playing the game. Whether this is an oversight in the ending's construction, a consequence of the narrative not fully accounting for the player's role in the battle, or a deliberate structural choice that uses the Senate's censure to demonstrate the Republic's institutional tendency to assign blame downward rather than accept systemic responsibility, is a question that the development record does not definitively resolve. Both readings are available. The ending contains both possibilities simultaneously without resolving them. The ambient sound of the turbine hall has 22 separately authored audio layers in its composite track. The layers include turbine harmonic recordings, water pressure sounds captured from intake structures, electrical hum from the generation equipment, and structural resonance from the concrete walls themselves. The building's physical response to the sustained mechanical activity occurring inside it. The audio team described the goal as producing a sound that communicated the continued functioning of a pre-war construction in a world that had otherwise stopped functioning. A low-frequency physical argument for the persistence of something that everything else in the Mojave had failed to sustain. The distinction between listening to the turbine hall on speakers and listening to it through headphones at high volume is the distinction between experiencing the composite as a single environmental sound and being able to distinguish individual layers within it. Both experiences are accurate representations of the same recording. The complexity is present, regardless of whether it is perceived. The gift shop in the lower intake area is still stocked. The inventory consists of items that were placed there when the dam was a civilian tourist destination. Snow globes containing miniature representations of the structure, pennants bearing the dam's name in the lettering style of the mid-20th century, postcard displays whose images show the facility as it appeared during the period of its active use as a recreational destination. The pricing on every item in the shop is denominated in pre-war dollars, a currency that has had no functional value for 2 centuries. The NCR maintains a military garrison in a building that contains a souvenir stand, operating on a 200-year-old pricing system for merchandise that nobody has purchased since before the war. The shop is not mentioned in any questline. It is simply present, fully stocked, waiting for visitors who are not coming, in a facility that is otherwise defined by the seriousness of what it holds and the cost of holding it. Hoover Dam was the NCR's argument made concrete. The demonstration that the Republic could hold something worth holding, that maintenance in itself was a form of commitment, that the post-war world did not have to be defined entirely by what it had lost. The turbines running in the hall below the administrative levels were proof that the pre-war world had built something capable of outlasting the conditions that destroyed everything else it built. The NCR had inherited that proof and kept it operational. Whatever its other failures, that was a genuine accomplishment. The dam was still doing what it was built to do. The soldiers stationed there were still doing what they were assigned to do. The water still moved. The power still flowed. And the flag above the intake towers caught the wind off the Colorado and held its position in the current, the two-headed bear facing both directions at once, looking at everything the Republic had come from and everything it was still reaching toward. From the crown of the dam, looking west across the water that backs up behind the structure into the Nevada basin, every location this journey has passed through is somewhere in that distance. The crater where the founding city stood, the vault beneath the California hills, the trading center that organized the Republic's economy before the Republic existed, the ruins of the city it claimed as its industrial base, the closed gates of the community that had everything and shared nothing, The mining town that built something worth learning from and was not learned from. The airport that became a headquarters. The neon streets outside the strip. The statues above the mountain pass. The solar array that nobody could operate. The motel with the dinosaur on the roof. The canyon where the plans ran out. The crater facility where the science continued without stopping. The dam holds all of that in its downstream face. The water behind it pressing against the concrete with the same force it has always pressed. The turbines converting that pressure into something usable. The whole structure doing quietly and continuously what it was designed to do. The light at this hour moves across the Mojave in a particular way. Low and warm, touching the western ridgelines before it reaches the desert floor, casting long shadows from every structure that still stands between here and the California border. From the railing at the crown of the dam, the entire basin is visible in a single field of view. The road running west toward the mountain pass with its two statues. The scattered lights beginning to appear in the settlements between here and there, the darkness collecting in the canyon terrain, to the east where the road stops being a road. Everything visited on this journey is just somewhere in that westward view, in the distance, or beneath the horizon, present in the landscape, whether visible or not. The flag above the intake tower faces both directions simultaneously. The two-headed bear was designed that way. One head oriented toward California, toward the territory the Republic was built from, toward the founding settlement, and the vault beneath the hills, and the trading city, and the ruins of Los Angeles, and all the absorbed communities that became the nation's western body. The other head faces east, toward the territory the Republic was always trying to reach, toward the Mojave Basin, and the dam and the road that ended at the divide, and everything still beyond that edge. Neither head faces the ground directly beneath the flag. Both are always looking somewhere other than where the Republic currently stands. Whether this is the symbol of an institution whose ambition exceeded its presence, or simply a design that captures something true about what it means to build a nation. That a nation is always partly what it was, and partly what it intends to become, is a question the flag cannot answer. It only displays the posture. The water behind the dam presses against the concrete in the gathering dark, steady and without urgency. The institution that flag represented lasted longer than most things in the post-war world last. From the founding of the small settlement in Northern California in the years following the Great War, through the decades of expansion documented in Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, through the Mojave campaign recorded in Fallout New Vegas, the new California Republic persisted as a functioning political body for over a century of documented history. Its apparent destruction, visible in the crater that opens the first season of the Fallout television series, the founding city reduced to a circle of ash at some point between 2277 and the show's present, is not a sudden ending, but the conclusion of a long exhaustion. The Republic did not collapse. It was removed, slowly, by forces that had been working against it before most of its citizens were born. The length of time it managed to continue, against the conditions the wasteland produces, and against the specific opposition documented in the television series, is not a small thing. It lasted. The question of whether lasting was enough is separate from the fact of the lasting itself. The second season of the Fallout television series returns to New Vegas, to the territory the Republic fought to control and never fully held. The placement of those events relative to the game's timeline is left open. The same city, a different moment in its history. The same streets under different conditions of occupation and abandonment and contested authority. The NCR's presence in that season is present in what is missing as much as in what appears directly. In the absence of institutions that should be there. In the gap between what the Republic built and what remains of what it built. This is the form the Republic takes in the later record. an absence that has the shape of something that was once present, visible in the outline it left behind. The last of the light holds at the western ridge for a moment before releasing. The tension the Republic carried through its entire documented history, between what its founding documents said it was and what its operational reality required it to be, was not a failure of intention. The designers who created the NCR described it as the best argument for flawed democracy that the wasteland could produce. An institution that had genuinely good principles, implemented by genuinely limited people, operating at a scale that consistently exceeded what any group of limited people can manage without the principles beginning to bend. The colonial practices in the Mojave, the prison labor on the rail lines, the citizenship tiers that left Freeside populated with the Republic's own displaced citizens. None of these were the intended outcome of the founding documents. They were the accumulated consequence of expansion, conducted faster than accountability could follow. The gap between what the NCR said it was and what it did is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is the record of an institution that kept trying to be better than its circumstances allowed, and kept falling short in the specific ways that large institutions fall short when they grow faster than their principles can scale. The color of NCR armor and uniforms, the particular tan that covers every soldier stationed from the California border to this railing, was chosen to evoke two things simultaneously: the terrain of California, the dry gold of the hills. In late summer, the color of the land the Republic came from, and the color of old flags left in direct sunlight for too long. Faded, still present, the patterns still visible, but the original intensity gone. The NCR was designed to look like a force that had been in the field past the point where it should have rotated out. Capable, organized, still moving, worn in a way that long service produces. The color communicates this before any dialogue begins. It is the first thing visible about a Republic soldier. It is also the most accurate summary of what the Republic was by the time the Mojave campaign reached its final stages. The anthem the Republic composed in its earliest years, referenced in the surviving documents from Shady Sands, describes the journey from the vault to the valley, from the ashes to the flag. It is a song about a distance traveled, about the specific movement from a sealed door in the California hills to a flag flying above a functioning nation. Standing at this railing, with the dam holding steady beneath the weight of the water behind it, and the lights coming on in the settlements to the west, that distance is visible in its full extent. The crater where the founding city stood, the concrete hatch above the vault that produced the first citizens, the dried riverbed of the trading city that organized the economy before the government arrived to claim it, the gutted towers of Los Angeles, the gleaming gates of the city that refused to open, the mine shafts of the desert settlement that built something worth learning from, the airport converted to a headquarters, the neon streets that held the Republic's displaced population, the statues above the mountain pass, the solar mirrors still tracking the sun, the motel with the concrete dinosaur, the canyon where the plans ended, the crater of the research facility still producing science without stopping, and the dam here at the eastern edge of the territory the Republic called its own. Turbines running, flag still up, the sound of the water and the machinery mixing into something that carries across the river and out into the desert beyond. They walked a long road. They built something real. Whether the cost was proportionate to what was built is the question that the wasteland does not answer, and that every civilization eventually faces in its own time and on its own terms. The dam held. The lights came on across the basin in the early dark. Somewhere to the west, past the mountain pass and the outpost and the miles of contested highway, there is a circle of ash where a city used to stand. The road between that ash and this railing is everything that was heard tonight, and the question of what it amounted to is one that can be carried into sleep and considered there, in the quiet, without urgency. The Mojave grows still, the water moves, the journey is complete,